Evelyn Blackwell stood in the doorway of the Copper Hollow boarding house, watching the richest rancher in Colorado Territory stride toward her with a bouquet of wildflowers meant for someone else. She knew what came next: the shock, the disappointment, the polite rejection. Her mother had sent her west as a joke, a cruel substitution for her beautiful half-sister, betting that no man would choose the plain daughter when promised perfection. But Constance Blackwell had miscalculated one critical detail. Some men value truth over beauty, and some women are done being anyone's punchline. If you are enjoying this story, please hit the like button and comment with your city so I can see how far this tale travels. Now let me take you back to where it all began. The parlor of the Blackwell mansion smelled of lilacs and malice, a combination Evelyn had learned to recognize before she could read. She sat in the corner chair, the one with the loose thread she'd worried smooth over 23 years of being decoratively invisible, and watched her mother orchestrate the afternoon's entertainment with the precision of a general planning an invasion. "Serena, darling, turn just slightly. Yes, there. The light catches your hair divinely that way." Constance Blackwell adjusted her youngest daughter's position by the window, where spring sunshine transformed Serena's golden curls into something approaching celestial. "Mrs. Hartford, you simply must tell me where you found that dressmaker. The cut is exquisite." Evelyn's fingers stilled on her embroidery. Not because the conversation interested her. 3 years of identical afternoon teas had long since numbed her to Boston society's circular obsessions, but because she'd just noticed the letter on the side table. Cream-colored paper, thick as linen, sealed with red wax that caught the light like a warning. "From Colorado Territory," Mrs. Hartford announced, her voice pitched to carry across the room and down the hall, probably to the servants' quarters, and possibly to the street beyond. "My nephew writes that Reed Callahan, the cattle baron who made his fortune in silver, is seeking a refined Eastern bride. Apparently the frontier lacks suitable women of breeding and education." The needle slipped, pricking Evelyn's thumb. She pressed the wound against her skirt, watching a small bloom of red soak into the brown fabric. Brown, because Constance insisted Evelyn wear colors that wouldn't draw attention. Browns and grays, and occasionally a deeply depressing shade of olive that made her skin look like old parchment. "How perfectly dreadful," Constance murmured, though her eyes had sharpened with the particular gleam that meant she was calculating something. "Imagine being so desperate as to advertise for a wife like one places in order for livestock." "Mother, really?" Serena's voice carried the gentle reproach of someone who'd never faced genuine cruelty, and therefore believed it didn't exist. "Perhaps the gentleman is simply lonely. The territory must be quite isolated." "Lonely and wealthy," Mrs. Hartford corrected, warming to her subject. "My nephew says Callahan's ranch spans 30,000 acres. He supplies beef to every mining camp from Denver to Leadville, and his home, well, they say it's the finest structure west of Kansas City. 3 stories, imported fixtures, furniture shipped from San Francisco." Evelyn watched her mother's expression shift from disdain to speculation. She knew that look, had seen it turned on other targets, business opportunities, social rivals, occasionally her father before he died and left them comfortable but not extravagant. Never before had she seen it directed at the letter on the side table. "How fascinating," Constance said softly. "And this Mr. Callahan has actually written seeking an introduction to suitable young ladies." "My nephew was merely making conversation," Mrs. Hartford replied, but she was smiling now, pleased to have sparked such interest. "Though I suppose if one were to know someone appropriate, someone refined and educated, accustomed to managing a large household." She trailed off meaningfully, glancing toward Serena, who immediately paled. "Mother, no. Absolutely not." "Darling, no one is suggesting—" "You are suggesting. You're always suggesting." Serena stood abruptly, her teacup rattling against its saucer with uncharacteristic clumsiness. "I am not traveling to some barbaric wilderness to marry a man who raises cattle. Thomas and I have an understanding. Thomas Hampton has been understanding you for 3 years without producing a ring," Constance interrupted, her voice sharp enough to draw blood. "His family finds you charming, but not quite suitable for their name. We've discussed this." Evelyn set down her embroidery and stood quietly, intending to slip from the room before the argument could escalate. These scenes always followed the same pattern: Serena's tears, Constance's cold fury, eventual capitulation from one or both parties, and absolutely no acknowledgement of Evelyn's presence throughout. She'd learned years ago that invisibility was safer than participation. "Sit down, Evelyn." The command froze her halfway to the door. She turned slowly, meeting her mother's gaze for the first time in weeks. Constance rarely looked directly at her. Doing so required acknowledging the resemblance to her first husband, the dock worker she'd married at 17 and buried at 20, before clawing her way into society through strategic remarriage to Serena's father. "Mrs. Hartford, would you excuse us for a moment?" Constance's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Family matters, you understand." Mrs. Hartford gathered her things with the reluctance of someone being denied a front-row seat to a spectacle, air-kissed Serena's cheeks, and swept from the room in a rustle of expensive silk. The moment the door clicked shut, Constance's smile vanished like morning frost under hard sun. "The letter is addressed to this household," she said, picking it up with 2 fingers as though it might contaminate her. "To any young lady of refinement and education seeking adventure and partnership in Colorado territory." She looked up, and Evelyn saw something in her mother's face she'd never seen before. Not anger, not disdain, but something closer to inspiration. "Mr. Callahan's cousin apparently stayed at the Hartford residence last month and was impressed by our family's reputation." "Then he was misinformed," Evelyn heard herself say. The words emerged before she could stop them, sharp and clear in the suddenly silent room. Serena gasped. Constance went very still. "I beg your pardon?" Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs, but something reckless had taken root in her chest. Something that had been growing for 23 years in the space between what she was and what she was allowed to be. "Our family's reputation is built on Father's money and your management of Serena's beauty, neither of which amounts to much when measured against actual character or substance." The slap came fast enough that Evelyn barely had time to turn her face. Her cheek burned, but she didn't raise a hand to it, didn't flinch, just stood there while Constance's breathing went shallow and quick. "How dare you?" her mother whispered. "After everything I've provided, this house, your education, your position in society, despite your father's common blood." "Position?" Evelyn laughed, surprising herself with the sound. "What position? The one in the corner where I'm furniture? The one at dinner parties where I'm introduced as Evelyn from the first marriage like I'm a regrettable piece of inherited china? That position? You ungrateful— Mother, please." Serena had started crying predictably. "Don't fight. Evelyn didn't mean it." But Evelyn did mean it, had meant it for years. And now that she'd started, the words kept coming like water through a cracked dam. "You want to know what I think? I think you should write to Mr. Callahan. Tell him you have the perfect bride, refined, educated, beautiful. Ship Serena west and solve both your problems at once. She'll get a wealthy husband far from Thomas Hampton's disapproving family, and you'll finally be rid of the daughter who reminds you where you came from." Constance's face had gone white, then red, then settled into something that looked almost like pleasure. Her eyes glittered. "What a remarkably clever idea," she said softly. "Though not quite the way you've suggested." Evelyn felt the first prickle of warning, but before she could step back, Constance had crossed the room and grabbed her wrist. Not hard enough to bruise, never hard enough to bruise where anyone might see, but tight enough to hold her in place. "Serena will not be going to Colorado territory," Constance continued, her voice pleasant as poisoned honey. "She has prospects here, even if they require patience and proper management. But you, my dear Evelyn, have made an excellent point. Mr. Callahan is expecting a refined Eastern bride, someone educated and capable of managing his household, someone from this family." "No." The word came out choked. "Mother, you can't—" "Can't what?" "Can't send my own daughter to an excellent marriage prospect? Can't provide you with exactly what you've been demanding, a position of your own, away from this house where you're so desperately unhappy?" Constance smiled, and it was the cruelest expression Evelyn had ever seen on a human face. "Or perhaps you're worried you won't measure up, that Mr. Callahan will take one look at you and realize he's been sold inferior goods?" Serena had stopped crying. She stood frozen by the window, backlit by spring sunshine, looking between her mother and half-sister with something like horror dawning in her eyes. "Mother, you cannot be serious. The letter was meant for any young lady of this household." "Well," Constance released Evelyn's wrist and smoothed her own skirts with hands that didn't shake even slightly. "And Evelyn is certainly that. In fact, I think she's perfect for the role. Strong, capable, accustomed to hard work. Why, she's practically a frontierswoman already. And if Mr. Callahan finds her not quite what he expected?" She shrugged. "Well, that will teach him the dangers of ordering a bride sight unseen, won't it?" The full shape of it hit Evelyn like a physical blow. This wasn't about providing her with opportunity. This was punishment for speaking up, for being her father's daughter, for existing as a constant reminder of Constance's origins. And worse, it was a joke, a deliberate humiliation designed to be shared later over tea with Mrs. Hartford and the other society women who traded cruelty like currency. Can you imagine? We sent plain Evelyn instead of beautiful Serena. I wish I could have seen his face when she stepped off that train. "You're insane," Evelyn breathed. "No, darling, I'm practical." Constance moved to her writing desk, extracting paper and pen with decisive movements. "You will write to Mr. Callahan tonight, accepting his proposal. You will be gracious and refined and everything a proper young lady should be in correspondence. And in 2 weeks, you will board a train to Colorado Territory and become Mrs. Reed Callahan, or more likely, you will become the rejected bride who had to crawl back to Boston, having learned a valuable lesson about knowing one's place. I won't do it. Then you'll be out of this house by morning with nothing but the clothes on your back and whatever you can carry." Constance looked up, and her eyes were flat as river stones. "Do you think your father's family will take you in? They barely acknowledged your existence when he was alive. The charity hospital where you volunteer? They don't pay their workers, Evelyn. And your education, extensive as it is, qualifies you for exactly nothing that will keep you fed and housed in this city. So you'll do this, or you'll discover very quickly what it means to be truly unwanted." The room had gone airless. Evelyn looked at Serena, hoping for what? Intervention? Support? But her half-sister had turned back to the window, shoulders hunched, determinedly studying the street below. No help would come from that direction. It never had. Evelyn's mind raced through options, each one closing like doors slamming shut. Constance was right about the practical realities. She had no money of her own, no family who would shelter her, no skills that translated to paid employment for a woman of her class. The hospital where she volunteered had taught her to set bones and mix medicines and deliver babies in emergency, but they'd never hire her officially. Respectable women didn't work for wages unless circumstances were desperate, and even then, the positions available barely paid enough for a boarding house room and 2 meals a day. But there was a third option taking shape in the back of her mind, a wild, reckless option that probably made her as insane as her mother. "I'll do it," she said quietly. Constance looked surprised for the first time in the conversation. "You'll do what?" "I'll write to Mr. Callahan. I'll accept his proposal. I'll go to Colorado Territory." Evelyn straightened her spine, meeting her mother's gaze with something that felt dangerously close to defiance. "But not as your joke, not as the humiliating surprise meant to teach him a lesson. I'll write as myself, Evelyn Blackwell, daughter of Thomas Blackwell, educated at Miss Porter's school, experienced in household management and medical care. I'll tell him the truth about who I am and what I can offer. And if he still wants to proceed, I'll go west and make a life there. A real life, mine." "You're serious?" Constance studied her for a long moment. "You actually think this backwater cattle baron will choose you once he knows what he's getting?" "I have no idea," Evelyn admitted. "But I'd rather be honestly rejected in Colorado than slowly suffocated in Boston. At least there, my failure will be my own instead of your entertainment." For a moment, just a heartbeat, something flickered across Constance's face that might have been respect. Then it vanished, replaced by the cold calculation Evelyn knew so well. "Write your letter," her mother said finally. "Be as honest as you like. But understand this. Once you leave this house for Colorado Territory, you don't come back. Not when it fails, not when he rejects you, not ever. You'll have made your choice, and you'll live with it. Do we have an understanding?" Evelyn thought about the corner chair with its worried smooth thread, about 23 years of being decoratively invisible, about the hospital ward where she felt more useful in 3 hours than she had in her entire life at home, about the possibility, slim and wild and probably doomed, of mattering to someone, somewhere, for something other than her ability to disappear. "We have an understanding," she said. The letter took 3 days to write. Not because the words were difficult, but because Evelyn kept tearing up drafts that sounded too desperate or too cold or too much like an apology for existing. Finally, on the fourth night, she sat down at her small desk and wrote the truth as plainly as she knew how. "Dear Mr. Callahan, I am writing in response to your letter seeking an Eastern bride, which was shared with our household by Mrs. Hartford. I should tell you immediately that I am not the young lady you may have been led to expect. My name is Evelyn Blackwell. I am 23 years old, educated at Miss Porter's School in Connecticut, and have spent the past 3 years volunteering at Boston Charity Hospital, where I have developed considerable practical medical knowledge. I am tall, 5 feet and 9 inches, which has been considered unfortunate in Boston society. I am plain-featured and strong-built, better suited to work than decoration. I have no musical accomplishments worth mentioning, though I read extensively and can manage household accounts with precision. I am my mother's daughter from her first marriage, which is considered a mark against me in our social circle. My father was a dock worker who died when I was 5. My mother remarried into respectability, and I have been living in her household ever since, occupying a position that is difficult to define, neither quite family nor quite servant, visible enough to be useful but not visible enough to matter. I tell you these things not to discourage your interest, but because I believe honesty is the only foundation worth building on. If you are seeking a beautiful ornament for your home, I am not suitable. But if you are seeking a capable partner, someone who values hard work and straight dealing, someone who wants to build a life of substance rather than merely display one, then perhaps we have something to discuss. I have no illusions about frontier life. I understand it will be difficult, isolated, and demanding, but I find I would rather face those challenges as my own person in Colorado than continue facing polite suffocation as my mother's afterthought in Boston. If this letter has not discouraged you entirely, I would welcome further correspondence. If it has, I understand completely and wish you well in your search. Respectfully, Evelyn Blackwell." She sealed it before she could reconsider, posted it herself at the corner box rather than leaving it for the household mail, and then waited through 2 weeks that felt like 2 years. Constance watched her with undisguised amusement. Serena alternated between guilt and relief. The household staff whispered in corners, shooting Evelyn looks that ranged from pity to incomprehension. Even Mrs. Hartford called again, ostensibly for tea, but really to see if the rumors were true. "Is it true you've written to Reed Callahan?" she asked, not bothering with subtlety. "Evelyn, dear, surely you understand that such arrangements are meant for women with limited options. You're a Blackwell, however, complicated your position. Surely there are suitable matches here in Boston." "Name one," Evelyn replied, and watched Mrs. Hartford founder through several false starts before making an excuse about a previous engagement and fleeing. The response came on a Wednesday afternoon in May, delivered by special courier, written in strong black ink on paper that smelled faintly of wood smoke and leather. "Miss Blackwell, your letter was the most honest piece of correspondence I've received in a decade. That alone makes you remarkable, regardless of what Boston society thinks of your height or your features or your father's occupation. I will tell you equally plainly what I am and what I'm offering. I am 35 years old, never married, owner of the Broken Creek Ranch outside Copper Hollow, Colorado Territory. I built everything I have from nothing, first in the silver camps, then in cattle, now in land and water rights, and the kind of future people come west to find. My house is large but empty. My ranch runs well but needs the kind of management only a true partner can provide. I am, as your friend Mrs. Hartford's nephew correctly reported, lonely. But more than that, I am tired of being alone. I don't need an ornament. I don't need someone to play piano in the parlor or pour tea for visiting dignitaries, because we don't have visiting dignitaries. What I need is someone real, someone who can look at a medical emergency or a broken fence or a difficult decision and act instead of fainting decoratively. Someone who understands that building a life is actual work, not a metaphor. Your height sounds practical. Your medical knowledge sounds invaluable. Your honesty is refreshing to the point of being shocking, which tells me you've spent too long around people who mistake cruelty for sophistication. If you're willing, come to Copper Hollow. I'll meet you at the boarding house when the train arrives. It's the only boarding house. You can't miss it. We'll talk honestly, as your letter and mine have been honest. And if, after that conversation, we both still want to proceed, we'll build something neither of us could build alone. I'm not promising easy or comfortable. I'm promising real. Reed Callahan. Evelyn read it 3 times, then walked downstairs and placed it on the tea table in front of her mother. I'm leaving in 2 weeks, she said. I'll need traveling clothes and enough money for the journey. After that, I'll expect nothing further from this household. Constance picked up the letter, read it with eyebrows climbing steadily toward her hairline, and then laughed. A short, sharp sound like breaking glass. Well, it seems Mr. Callahan has low standards. How convenient for you. Or perhaps he has different standards, Evelyn replied. One set that values something beyond what can be seen across a ballroom. You're actually doing this. Serena had appeared in the doorway, eyes wide. Evelyn, you're actually going to marry a complete stranger and move to the wilderness? I'm going to meet him, Evelyn corrected. And then, if we both choose it, yes. I'm going to build a life with someone who wants a partner instead of a decoration. I'm going to be useful. I'm going to matter. She looked at her mother. Those are foreign concepts in this house, I know. But out there, I suspect they're the entire point. The 2 weeks that followed passed in a strange fog. Constance fulfilled the letter of their agreement, provided traveling clothes, though they were Evelyn's usual browns and grays rather than anything fine. Provided money for the journey, though only just enough. Provided nothing else, including farewell. On her last night in Boston, Evelyn stood in her small room and packed her trunk with efficient movements born of years watching her own invisibility. Practical clothes, a few books, her medical notes from the hospital. The letter from Reed Callahan, already worn soft at the creases from being read and reread. I brought you something. She turned to find Serena in the doorway, holding a small wooden box. I don't want your guilt, Evelyn said quietly. It's not guilt, or not just guilt. Serena came in and set the box on the bed. It was grandmother's. Mother doesn't know I kept it. She opened the lid to reveal a simple gold locket on a thin chain. She would have wanted you to have something, I think, something that was yours. Evelyn picked up the locket, surprised by the weight of it. Inside was a miniature portrait of a young woman with strong features and steady eyes, eyes that looked back at her from every mirror. That's Grandmother Blackwell, Serena explained, Father's mother. She died before I was born, but Father used to tell me about her, how she could outwork any man on the docks, how she raised 3 children mostly by herself when Grandfather's ship went down, how she... Serena stopped, swallowed hard. How she deserved better than what she got, like you do. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt something toward her half-sister that wasn't resentment or envy. Thank you, she said, and meant it. Will you write? Serena asked. Not to Mother, obviously, but to me? I want to know if... She trailed off. If what? If it's possible, Serena whispered, to choose something different, to be someone different than what they expect. Evelyn fastened the locket around her neck. All right, she promised. But Serena, you have to choose it. No one can do that part for you. She left before dawn the next morning while Constance slept and Serena watched from an upstairs window. The train station smelled of coal smoke and coffee and the particular electricity of people in motion, people going places, people becoming. Evelyn bought her ticket, boarded the westbound train, and didn't look back at Boston even once. The journey took 6 days, through New York, across Pennsylvania, into Ohio, where the cities gave way to farmland, then across the endless plains where the sky got bigger and the air got cleaner, and gradually, mile by mile, Evelyn felt something in her chest loosening. By the time the train pulled into Copper Hollow, Colorado territory, she was ready. Not confident, not certain, but ready. She'd spent the journey preparing her arguments for why Reed Callahan should still choose her despite the gap between fantasy and reality. She'd rehearsed speeches and planned explanations and steeled herself for disappointment. What she hadn't prepared for was the man standing on the platform. Reed Callahan was tall, taller than her by a hand's width, with broad shoulders and sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of winter sky. He wore range clothes instead of formal attire, and his hands when he removed his hat looked like they knew real work. He was scanning the crowd of departing passengers with an expression that was equal parts hope and anxiety. And when his gaze passed over Evelyn the first time without stopping, she felt her carefully constructed courage starting to crack. Then his eyes came back. Stopped. Held. He crossed the platform in long strides, his gaze never leaving her face. And for a terrible moment, Evelyn was certain he was going to tell her there had been a mistake, thank her for coming all this way, and send her back on the next eastbound train. Instead, he stopped 3 feet away and said, "Miss Blackwell?" His voice was deeper than she'd imagined, rougher, real in a way that made every man she'd ever met in Boston seem like a carefully rehearsed performance. "Yes," she managed. "Mr. Callahan, I should explain—" "You're taller than I expected," he interrupted. Then, at her expression, "That's a compliment. My ranch foreman is 5'6" and has a complex about it. This will make him insufferable." He smiled, and the expression transformed his entire face from merely handsome to genuinely kind. "Miss Blackwell, are you going to tell me there's been some kind of mistake or substitution? Because if so, I'd prefer to hear it now before I make a fool of myself." The moment stretched. Evelyn could feel the weight of 6 days of travel, 23 years of being unwanted, and her mother's final cruel joke all balanced on the edge of whatever she said next. "My mother sent me instead of my half-sister," she heard herself say. "Serena is the beautiful one, the one you were supposed to meet. I'm the replacement, the joke. I'm sorry you had to come all this way for—" "Stop." Reed held up one hand, and something in his face had gone very still. "Your mother did what?" "She—" Evelyn swallowed hard. "When your letter arrived, it was meant for Serena. But Serena didn't want to come west, and Mother thought she thought it would be amusing to send me instead, to teach you some kind of lesson about ordering brides sight unseen. I tried to explain in my letter, but I didn't want to be too explicit about—" "Your letter was honest about who you are," Reed interrupted, his voice quiet but carrying an edge like struck steel. "What it wasn't explicit about was that your mother used you as a weapon in someone else's joke." He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face while Evelyn fought the urge to look away. "What do you want, Miss Blackwell?" The question caught her completely off guard. "What do I want?" "Yes, not what your mother wants, not what society expects, not what you think I want to hear. What do you want?" No one had ever asked her that, not once in 23 years. "I want to matter," Evelyn said, and her voice broke on the last word. "I want to be valued for who I am, not apologized for. I want to work hard and see the results of that work. I want to wake up in the morning and know that my presence makes a difference, even a small one. I want—" She stopped because the rest was too much to say aloud. "I want to be chosen, just once, by someone who knows exactly what they're choosing." Reed was quiet for another long moment. Then he picked up her trunk, hoisted it onto his shoulder like it weighed nothing, and started walking toward a wagon hitched at the edge of the platform. "Come on," he said over his shoulder. "Where are we going?" "To the ranch, unless you want to head back to Boston on the next train." He stopped, turned back to face her. "Miss Blackwell, Evelyn, if I may, I didn't come all this way expecting perfection. I came expecting honesty, capability, and someone who was willing to build something real. Your letter promised all three. Nothing I see standing here contradicts that promise. So the question isn't whether I still want to proceed. The question is whether you do." The platform was emptying. Other passengers had been claimed by family or disappeared into town. Soon it would be just her and Reed Callahan, and a decision that would determine the shape of her entire life. "I want to proceed," Evelyn said. "Good." Reed smiled again, that same transformation from handsome to kind. "Then let's go home." Home. The word hung in the air between them, full of possibility and promise, and the kind of terrifying hope Evelyn hadn't let herself feel in years. She followed Reed Callahan to his wagon, climbed up onto the bench seat, and turned her face toward the mountains rising sharp and snow-capped against the western sky. Behind her, Boston and her mother's cruel joke were already fading into memory. Ahead, Copper Hollow waited, unknown and uncertain and completely, thrillingly hers to discover. The wagon rolled forward, wheels crunching on the dry road, carrying Evelyn Blackwell toward the first day of a life she'd chosen for herself. Whatever came next, rejection or acceptance, failure or success, it would be real. And real, she was learning, was worth any amount of risk. The ranch appeared gradually, emerging from the landscape like something inevitable rather than built. First, the boundary fence, solid posts and clean wire marking the transition from open territory to claimed land. Then the hayfield, spring green and neat as a promise. Then the outbuildings, weathered but well-maintained, arranged with the logic of function rather than decoration. And finally, the house itself. Evelyn had expected something rough. A cabin, perhaps, or at best a simple frame structure with pretensions of refinement. What she saw instead made her breath catch. 3 stories of honey-colored wood and river stone, windows that caught the late afternoon sun like fire. A wraparound porch that suggested someone had envisioned sitting there in the evenings, watching the mountains turn purple with distance. Not the finest structure west of Kansas City, perhaps, but close enough to make Mrs. Hartford's description seem less like exaggeration and more like understatement. "Built it myself," Reed said, following her gaze. "Well, myself and a crew of 15 men over 2 summers. The stone came from the creek bed, hence the name. The timber's local pine. Everything else got hauled in from Denver or shipped from San Francisco, which is why some of the interior looks like it can't quite decide what it wants to be." He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the porch. "Fair warning, I built it for a fantasy, the Boston porcelain bride who'd cure my loneliness with cultured conversation and probably faint at the sight of a branding iron." Evelyn turned to look at him. "And instead you got a dock worker's daughter who knows how to set a broken bone but can't play piano worth a damn." "Instead I got honesty," Reed corrected, "which is considerably more valuable than piano playing when you're 60 miles from the nearest actual doctor." He climbed down from the wagon, then moved to help her, his hands at her waist steady and impersonal. "The house has running water. I installed a cistern system last year. Indoor plumbing, mostly functional. A kitchen that's larger than strictly necessary because I kept adding things I thought a refined woman might need. And empty rooms on the second floor where I imagine children might eventually sleep, though I'm beginning to think I got ahead of myself on that count." The vulnerability in that last sentence made Evelyn's chest ache. She understood suddenly what this house represented. Not wealth or status, but hope. Years of hope built into every board and stone, every window frame and door hinge, all of it waiting for someone to make it more than just beautiful emptiness. "Show me," she said. Reed's expression shifted, something like relief flickering across his features. He grabbed her trunk again and led her up the porch steps, through a front door that opened onto a hallway floored in polished wood. The interior smelled of beeswax and leather and the faint smokiness that seemed to cling to everything out here. To the left, a parlor with furniture that looked expensive but unused. To the right, a dining room with a table that could seat 12 but probably never had. Straight ahead, a staircase that curved up into shadows. "Kitchen's through here," Reed said, leading her down the hall. "This is where I actually live, if I'm being honest. The rest of the house is more aspiration than habitation." The kitchen was enormous, easily twice the size of the one in Constance's Boston mansion. A massive cast-iron stove dominated one wall, and copper pots hung from ceiling hooks like patient bells. The counters were scarred with use, the floor scuffed from boot heels, and a battered table sat beneath the window with 2 chairs instead of the 8 the room could accommodate. This, Evelyn thought, was where the fantasy met reality, where a lonely man made coffee before dawn and ate supper by lamplight, surrounded by space he'd built for a future that hadn't arrived. Until now. Maybe. "It's perfect," she said, and watched Reed's shoulders drop half an inch, tension she hadn't realized he was carrying suddenly released. "The hands eat in the bunkhouse," he explained, setting her trunk down near the door. "I tried having them eat here when I first built the place, but it felt wrong somehow.
too much formality. They're more comfortable in their own space, and frankly, so am I. But I thought, if we... He stopped, ran a hand through his hair, clearly uncomfortable with the half-finished sentence. I thought maybe it would be different, having someone to share meals with who wasn't an employee. Evelyn moved to the window, looking out over a kitchen garden that showed signs of recent neglect.
Raised beds with weeds creeping in, bean poles leaning at angles, a few determined herbs struggling through the chaos. Someone used to tend this, she observed. Maria, my foreman's mother. She kept house for me the first 2 years, but her arthritis got bad enough that climbing the hill from their cabin became too painful. That was 8 months ago. I've been managing on my own since then, which mostly means I've been living on coffee, beef, and whatever I can cook without setting the house on fire. You must be severely deficient in vegetables, Evelyn said, and was surprised when Reed laughed, a genuine sound that echoed off the copper pots. Doc Patterson in town tells me the same thing every time I see him, usually while he's treating one of my men for some injury or other. He's got a theory that scurvy makes you accident-prone, though I suspect the accidents have more to do with working cattle in rough country than dietary limitations. Evelyn turned from the window. How many hands do you employ? 15 full-time, another dozen seasonal during roundup and drives. It's enough to run 30,000 acres if everyone stays healthy and nothing goes catastrophically wrong, which it does approximately twice a year regardless of planning. Reed leaned against the doorframe, studying her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. Miss Blackwell, Evelyn, I need to know what you're thinking. You've been silent for the last 5 miles, and I can't tell if that's because you're horrified by what you've gotten yourself into or just processing. Evelyn looked around the kitchen again, seeing not what was, but what could be. The garden restored and productive, the table full of people in conversation instead of solitary meals, the empty rooms upstairs given purpose, the entire house transformed from monument to hope into actual home. It was overwhelming in scope, but the alternative was going back to Boston, to the corner chair, to being decoratively invisible until she died there, unremarked and unmourned. I'm thinking this feels real, she said finally. Impossibly real, after years of feeling like a ghost in my own life. And I'm thinking that scares me more than I expected it to. Reed nodded slowly. Honest again, that's good. He was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats and male voices approaching from one of the outbuildings. His expression shifted immediately from vulnerable to guarded. That'll be Miguel and some of the hands. I should warn you, they've been expecting the refined Boston lady I kept talking about. This might be awkward. More awkward than explaining to you that my mother sent me as a joke? Evelyn asked dryly. Fair point. Reed moved to the door, then paused. If they say anything that makes you uncomfortable, tell me. Some of them have been out here too long without any civilizing influence whatsoever. And they occasionally forget how to behave around women who aren't saloon girls. Before Evelyn could respond, the door swung open and 3 men crowded into the kitchen, bringing with them the smells of horse and dust and honest sweat. They stopped abruptly at the sight of her, and Evelyn watched their expressions cycle rapidly through surprise, confusion, and in the case of the shortest one, poorly concealed disappointment. Afternoon, boss, the shortest man said, his gaze sliding from Evelyn to Reed and back again. Didn't realize you had company. Miguel, Jack, Tom, this is Miss Evelyn Blackwell from Boston. My intended, if she decides I'm worth the trouble. Reed's voice carried a warning note that the men clearly recognized. Evelyn, this is Miguel Reyes, my foreman, Jack Carson, who handles the horses, and Tom Fletcher, who's supposed to be fixing the north fence, but apparently decided visiting was more important. Miguel, who Evelyn guessed was in his 50s with silver threading through black hair, stepped forward and removed his hat. His eyes were sharp and assessing, taking in her height, her practical traveling clothes, her uncalloused but capable-looking hands. Whatever he was looking for, he seemed to find enough of it to satisfy him because he nodded once, decisively. Miss Blackwell, welcome to Broken Creek. He shot a glance at Reed that carried what looked like approval. Boss didn't tell us you were arriving today, or we'd have made the place more presentable. The place looks fine, Evelyn said, then added, though I notice the kitchen garden needs attention. If someone can point me toward tools, I'd like to start addressing that tomorrow. All 3 men looked startled. Jack, who was younger than the others,
with sandy hair and sunburned cheeks, actually laughed.
"Ma'am, we've got men for that kind of work. No need for you to—" "I volunteered at a hospital in Boston for 3 years," Evelyn interrupted calmly. "I've cleaned wounds, assisted with amputations, and once helped deliver twins during a blizzard when the doctor couldn't get through the snow. I assure you, weeding a garden won't damage my delicate sensibilities." She glanced at Reed. "Unless there's some reason I shouldn't?" Reed was trying not to smile. "No reason at all. The tools are in the shed behind the house. Miguel's mother, Maria, would probably be grateful someone's finally taking it in hand. She feels guilty about letting it go." "Tom was just saying yesterday that he misses having fresh greens with supper," Miguel offered, shooting his companion a look that suggested Tom had said no such thing. "Isn't that right, Tom?" Tom, who was broad as a barn door and looked like he'd never voluntarily eaten a vegetable in his life, nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, sir. Been craving greens, something fierce." The lie was so transparent that Evelyn felt something unexpected bubble up in her chest. Amusement. Genuine amusement at these rough men trying to make her feel welcome in their own awkward way. It was more kindness than she'd received from Boston society in years. "Well then," she said, "I better get started soon. Can't have the hands suffering from greens deficiency." Miguel grinned. Jack laughed outright. Even Tom cracked a smile. Reed, she noticed, had relaxed against the doorframe again, watching the interaction with something in his expression that made her pulse quicken. "Miss Blackwell, I think you're going to fit in just fine," Miguel said. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we should get back to work before the boss remembers that fence won't fix itself." He herded the other two toward the door, pausing to add, "Ma is going to want to meet you properly. I'll bring her by tomorrow if that's acceptable." "I'd like that," Evelyn said, and meant it. The door closed behind them, leaving her alone with Reed again. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller, more intimate. Reed pushed off from the doorframe and crossed to the stove, pulling down 2 cups from a shelf. "Coffee?" he asked. "Please." He poured from a pot that had been sitting on the back burner, the liquid black and strong-looking. Evelyn accepted her cup and sipped carefully, then nearly choked. It was the most powerfully bitter thing she'd ever tasted, like distilled wakefulness with a hint of battery acid. Reed noticed her expression and grimaced. "Too strong?" "It's certainly decisive," Evelyn managed, setting the cup down before her stomach could lodge a formal complaint. "How much coffee do you use per pot?" "However much it takes to feel adequately fortified for the day ahead," Reed offered. "I've never actually measured. Why, am I doing it wrong?" "You're doing it memorably," Evelyn said diplomatically. "May I try making a pot, just to see if there's a middle ground between this and warm water?" Something in Reed's face softened. "You're really going to stay, aren't you? This isn't just politeness before you tell me you're catching the next train back to civilization." Evelyn looked at him, really looked at him for the first time since arriving. Saw the hope he was trying to hide, the vulnerability he'd built a house around, the loneliness that had driven him to write to strangers seeking partnership. Saw, too, the strength in his frame, the calluses on his hands, the directness in his gaze that suggested he'd never learned to lie comfortably. He was nothing like the men she'd known in Boston, with their polished manners and calculated charm. He was real in a way that made her previous life feel like elaborate theater. "I'm going to stay," she said. "If you're certain you want me to." "I'm certain." Reed set his own cup down, untasted. "Evelyn, I want to be clear about something. The house, the ranch, everything. I built it hoping for partnership, not ownership. I'm not looking for someone to order around or someone who'll just agree with everything I say. I need someone who'll challenge me when I'm wrong, who'll bring their own skills and judgment to decisions, who'll be a true partner in building this place into something that matters. If that's not what you want, tell me now." "That's exactly what I want," Evelyn said, and felt the truth of it settle in her bones. "Mr. Callahan." "Reed, please, if we're going to be partners, we should probably use first names." "Reed," she tried, and found the name fit comfortably in her mouth. "I need to be honest with you about something. I've spent my entire life being told, directly and indirectly, that I'm not quite good enough, not pretty enough, not graceful enough, not whatever enough to matter in the world I was born into. Coming here, accepting your offer. It's terrifying because part of me is waiting for you to realize they were right. that I'm not actually worth choosing. Reed was quiet for a long moment. Then he crossed the kitchen until he was standing close enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to meet his eyes. Your mother was wrong, he said simply. So was everyone else who made you feel that way. You're worth choosing, Evelyn, not despite who you are, but because of it, and I intend to prove that to you every day we're together, for however long you'll let me try. The words hit her like a physical thing, breaking through defenses she'd spent 23 years building. She felt tears start and blinked them back furiously, refusing to cry in front of this man who'd shown her more honest kindness in 3 hours than her own mother had in a lifetime. I should probably see the rest of the house, she said, her voice not quite steady, before it gets dark. Reed understood the deflection for what it was and stepped back, giving her space to breathe. Of course. Your room is upstairs. I'll show you. He led her up the curved staircase to the second floor, where a hallway stretched in both directions lined with closed doors. Reed opened the one nearest the stairs to reveal a bedroom that was clearly meant to be the finest in the house. Large windows overlooked the mountains. The bed was solid oak with a quilt that looked handmade, and a wardrobe stood against one wall with space enough for a society woman's entire wardrobe. This is yours, Reed said. I'm down the hall in the room at the end. There's a washroom between. The plumbing's a little temperamental, but it works more often than not. The other rooms are empty. I thought. He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. You thought there might be children eventually, Evelyn finished quietly. It's all right to say it, Reed. It's a reasonable hope for people who marry. Is it something you want? Children? The question was careful, like he was afraid of the answer. Evelyn moved to the window, looking out at the mountains going purple with approaching dusk. I've never let myself think too much about it. Wanting things felt dangerous when nothing I wanted seemed achievable. But yes, I think I'd like children, a family. The real kind, not the kind I grew up in where some people matter more than others. Then that's what we'll build, Reed said. If you'll have me. If we suit. I don't want to rush you into anything before you're certain. We could have a long engagement, take time to... How long? Evelyn interrupted. Reed blinked. How long what? How long would a long engagement be? Months? Years? I hadn't thought about specifics. As long as you needed to be comfortable. Evelyn turned from the window to face him. Reed, I'm 23 years old, and I've never made a single important decision about my own life. Every choice has been made for me, or in spite of me. The school I attended, the clothes I wore, the position I occupied in society, all of it determined by other people's judgment of my worth. Coming here was the first thing I chose for myself, and now I'm standing in this house that you built hoping for partnership, and you're offering me exactly what I've wanted my entire life. So I need to know, if I say yes, if I say, let's do this properly and soon, are you going to think I'm reckless or desperate? I'm going to think you're brave, Reed said quietly, and honest, and the best thing that's ever happened to my lonely ranch and my overbuilt house and my terrible coffee. Evelyn laughed, surprising herself. Your coffee truly is appalling. I know. I make it that way deliberately to prove I need help with domestic matters. That's a terrible courtship strategy. It worked, didn't it? You're already planning to fix things. I am definitely fixing the coffee, Evelyn agreed. Among other things. But Reed, I'm serious. I don't need a long engagement. I need to know this is real, that I'm not going to wake up tomorrow and discover it was all some elaborate extension of my mother's joke. I need... She stopped, searching for the right words. I need to stop waiting for my life to start. Reed crossed the room until he was standing in front of her again. This time he reached out slowly, giving her time to step back if she wanted. When she didn't, he took her hand, the first time he'd touched her beyond the impersonal help from the wagon. His palm was warm and calloused, the hand of someone who'd built everything he had from raw determination and honest work. Then let's not wait, he said. There's a preacher in town who does weddings on Saturdays. It's Thursday now. That gives us 2 days to be absolutely certain this is what we both want. 2 days to talk honestly, to ask hard questions, to look for reasons this might not work. And if at the end of those 2 days we both still want to proceed, we get married Saturday afternoon and start building the life we both deserve. Does that sound reasonable? 2 days. 48 hours to decide the shape of her entire future. It should have felt rushed, reckless, impossibly fast. Instead, it felt like the most measured decision she'd ever made. "That sounds perfectly reasonable," Evelyn said. Reed's smile transformed his entire face again. "Then tomorrow morning I'll introduce you to the ranch properly. You can meet the rest of the hands, see what you're actually getting yourself into. And I'll answer any questions you have about what life here really looks like. The good, the bad, and the occasionally catastrophic." "I look forward to it," Evelyn said, and realized she meant it. For the first time in her life, she was genuinely looking forward to tomorrow. Reed squeezed her hand once, gently, then released it and stepped back. "I'll let you settle in. There's water in the pitcher, fresh linens in the wardrobe. Come down when you're ready, and I'll attempt to make us some supper that won't poison us both." "I can help," Evelyn offered. "Not tonight. Tonight you're a guest. Tomorrow you can start reorganizing my entire life, but tonight, just rest." He moved to the door, paused. "Evelyn, thank you for coming. Thank you for being honest. And thank you for not laughing at my house that's too big and my coffee that's too strong and my hope that probably should be too foolish but somehow isn't." Before she could respond, he was gone, closing the door softly behind him. Evelyn stood in the center of her new room, her room, at least for now, and let herself feel the full weight of what she'd just agreed to. Marriage in 2 days to a man she'd known for less than 6 hours. A life on a working ranch 60 miles from the nearest real town. Partnership with someone who looked at her and saw capability instead of disappointment. It was insane. Reckless. Exactly the kind of impulsive decision her mother would claim proved Evelyn's fundamental unsuitability for polite society. And it felt, for the first time in 23 years, exactly right. She moved to her trunk and began unpacking, laying out her few possessions in the wardrobe's generous space. The brown dresses looked even more depressing in this room full of light and possibility. Tomorrow, she thought, she'd ask about fabric in town. She'd need practical clothes for ranch work anyway, and there was no reason practical couldn't also be pretty, or at least not aggressively ugly. By the time she made her way back downstairs, full darkness had fallen and lamplight glowed warm from the kitchen. She found Reed at the stove, attempting to fry steaks in a pan that was smoking ominously. He looked up at her approach, relief evident in his expression. "Thank God. I'm about 30 seconds from setting off every smoke alarm I don't have. Do you know how to—" "Move," Evelyn commanded, and he stepped aside immediately. She grabbed the pan, moved it off the heat, opened the window over the sink to clear the smoke, then examined the steaks. Badly charred on one side, completely raw on the other. "Reed, how long have you been living alone?" 8 months since Maria left. But in my defense, I'm usually so tired by supper that I don't care if food is properly cooked as long as it's technically edible. That explains your continued survival, but not how you haven't burned the house down. Evelyn found a clean pan, started over with the steaks at a lower temperature, and began looking through the pantry for anything that might constitute a proper meal. She found potatoes, slightly elderly but usable, onions, salt pork, enough to work with. "Tomorrow I'm taking full inventory of your supplies. Tonight, we're improvising." "Yes, ma'am," Reed said meekly, and stayed out of her way while she worked. They ate at the small table by the window, and if the meal wasn't anything special, it was at least properly cooked and relatively balanced. Reed cleaned his plate with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been living on burnt meat and bitter coffee for months. "That was the best meal I've had in this house since Maria left," he declared, "and I'm including the times I tried to follow her recipes and nearly poisoned myself." "The bar is apparently very low," Evelyn observed, but she was smiling. "Tell me about the ranch. How many cattle do you run?" Reed launched into a detailed explanation that started with herd numbers and evolved into stories about difficult winters, narrow escapes, and the specific challenges of managing thousands of acres of high country range. Evelyn listened, asked questions, and gradually built a picture of the life she'd be entering. It was harder than she'd imagined, colder winters, more isolation, longer hours, and more physical demands than anything she'd experienced. But it was also more genuine, more purposeful, more real than any future Boston had ever offered. "What about medical care?" she asked eventually. "You mentioned a doctor in town, but what happens when someone's injured and town is too far away?" Reed's expression turned serious. "We do our best. Most of the hands know basic field medicine.
how to stop bleeding, splint breaks, that sort of thing. But we've lost men before. 2 years ago, a seasonal hand got kicked by a horse, crushed his skull. He was dead before we could get him loaded on a wagon. Last year, Miguel's nephew broke his arm so badly the bone came through the skin. We got him to Doc Patterson, but he lost use of 3 fingers from infection that set in during the ride. That shouldn't have happened, Evelyn said quietly. Compound fractures need immediate cleaning and stabilization. If you'd had someone who knew what they were doing right there when it happened, but we didn't. Reed leaned forward, his gaze intent. Evelyn, if you're asking whether your hospital training would be valuable here, the answer is absolutely yes. Doc Patterson is 65 and drinks too much. He's competent when he's sober, but getting him here takes time we don't always have. If you could handle emergencies until we can get people to proper care, you'd probably save lives. But that's not... I don't want you thinking that's why I want you here. It's not a condition or an expectation. It's just a reality of frontier life, Evelyn finished. I understand. And Reed, you should know, I want to use those skills. I've spent 3 years learning medicine I'm not allowed to practice because Boston doesn't approve of women doctors. Out here, away from those restrictions, I could actually help people. That matters to me. It matters more than almost anything. Reed studied her across the table, lamplight casting shadows that made his features look carved from stone. You really are nothing like what I expected, he said finally, and I mean that as the highest possible compliment. Later, after she'd climbed the stairs to her room and lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the unfamiliar silence of the Colorado night, Evelyn replayed that conversation in her mind. She thought about Reed's honesty, his willingness to show vulnerability, his genuine respect for her skills and judgment. She thought about the house he'd built hoping for partnership, the life he wanted to create, the future he was offering. And she thought about the question he'd asked her on the train platform. What do you want? The answer came clear as mountain water. This, all of this. The hard work and genuine purpose and partnership with someone who valued truth over performance. The chance to be useful, to matter, to build something real from honest foundation. The possibility of family that wasn't based on hierarchy and cruelty, but on mutual respect and shared effort. She wanted this life, wanted it with an intensity that frightened and exhilarated her in equal measure. 2 days, she reminded herself. 2 days to be certain, to ask hard questions, to look for reasons it might not work. But as she drifted towards sleep in her comfortable bed in the house Reed had built, Evelyn suspected she'd already made her decision. Everything else was just confirmation of what her heart had known, the moment he'd asked her what she wanted, and actually waited to hear the answer. Tomorrow would bring the reality test. Meeting the full crew, seeing the ranch in daylight, understanding the true scope of what she'd be taking on. But tonight, for the first time in 23 years, Evelyn Blackwell fell asleep feeling chosen, valued, home. And if the word home came packaged with a man she'd known less than a day, a ranch she'd barely seen, and a future that was still mostly theoretical, well, she'd taken bigger risks with worse odds. At least this time, she was betting on herself as much as on circumstance. The mountain wind whispered against the windows, and somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed softly in their pastures. The sounds of a working ranch settling into night, and the sounds that would shape the rhythm of her days from now forward. If she chose it. When she chose it. 2 days to be certain. But certainty, Evelyn was learning, sometimes came faster than caution allowed. She woke to unfamiliar sounds, the low of cattle, the creak of wood settling, and voices calling to each other in the pre-dawn darkness. For a disoriented moment, Evelyn thought she was back in Boston, that the train journey and Reed Callahan and the impossible house had all been some vivid fever dream. Then she opened her eyes to mountain light streaming through windows that faced west instead of east, and reality settled over her with the weight of genuine consequence. She was in Colorado territory, in a rancher's house, about to spend her second day deciding whether to marry a man she'd known less than 24 hours. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, she felt oddly calm as she dressed in one of her practical brown dresses and made her way downstairs, following the scent of coffee that was somehow even more aggressive than yesterday's batch. Reed was in the kitchen, staring at the stove with an expression of profound betrayal. He looked up at her approach, and his face transformed with relief so obvious it made her chest ache. "Thank God you're real," he said.
I was half convinced I'd imagined you and would wake up to another year of my own terrible cooking. I'm distressingly real, Evelyn assured him, moving past him to examine the coffee pot. Read, exactly how much coffee did you put in here? Enough? He offered it like a question. Maybe too much? The line between adequate fortification and toxic sludge is apparently very narrow, and I keep landing on the wrong side of it. Evelyn dumped the pot's contents out the window. Somewhere outside, a chicken squawked indignantly and started fresh with a quantity of grounds that was actually proportional to the amount of water. How have you survived this long? Stubbornness and spite, mostly. Also, Miguel's mother brought me food twice a week until her arthritis got too bad, and the hands occasionally take pity on me. Reed leaned against the counter, watching her work with an expression that was part admiration and part relief. I wasn't exaggerating about needing help with domestic matters. Clearly not. Evelyn set the coffee to brew properly, then turned to inventory the pantry with more attention than she'd given it last night. Flour, cornmeal, dried beans, salt pork, and precious little else. Reed, when was the last time you went to town for supplies? Define supplies and town in this context, Reed said carefully. Food. Actual food that isn't dried, salted, or coffee-based. From the mercantile in Copper Hollow that presumably exists. 6 weeks ago? Reed offered. Maybe 8? I keep meaning to make the trip, but something always comes up, and I can survive on what's here if I'm not particular about nutrition or flavor. You're describing scurvy, Reed. That's not survival, that's slow deterioration. Evelyn made a mental list of what they'd need, which was essentially everything. We're going to town today. After you show me the ranch, we're taking a wagon to the mercantile and buying enough food to get us through the next month at minimum. I was planning to introduce you to the full crew this morning, Reed said. Thought you should see the operation in daylight. Meet everyone. Understand what you'd be... He stopped, his expression shifting. You said us. We're buying enough food for us. Well, I'm certainly not stocking a kitchen for one person when there are 2 of us living here, Evelyn pointed out reasonably. Unless you're planning to continue poisoning yourself with burnt meat and toxic coffee out of some perverse sense of independence. Reed was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke his voice had gone rough. You're staying. You've already decided. I've decided I want to stay, Evelyn corrected, pending the next day and a half of thorough investigation to confirm I'm not making a catastrophic mistake. But yes, functionally, I'm staying, so we might as well have edible food while I complete my due diligence. The smile that broke across Reed's face was like sunrise over the mountains, slow, inevitable, transforming everything it touched. Right then. Let me finish this coffee you've miraculously made drinkable, and I'll take you out to meet the crew. Fair warning, they're going to have questions. What kind of questions? The kind that boil down to, is the boss actually getting married, or is this another one of his elaborate plans that falls apart at the last minute? Reed poured them both coffee, and Evelyn had to admit it was substantially better than yesterday's attempt. I have a reputation for overthinking things. Last year I spent 3 months planning an expansion to the horse barn, drew up detailed blueprints, ordered lumber from Denver, and then didn't build it because I convinced myself the money would be better spent on breeding stock. Was the money better spent on breeding stock? Probably, but now we've got 6 more horses and still need a bigger barn. Reed drained his cup. The point is, the hands know I'm capable of talking myself out of things. They're going to be watching to see if I actually follow through this time. Evelyn straightened her spine. Then let's go show them you're following through. The morning was crisp and clear, the kind of spring day that made Boston's weather seem like a pale imitation of actual seasons. Reed led her out past the house toward the complex of barns and outbuildings she'd glimpsed yesterday. In daylight, the scope of the operation became clear. Corrals holding dozens of horses, cattle visible in distant pastures, men moving with the purposeful efficiency of people who knew their work intimately. Miguel spotted them first and called out something in Spanish that made the other men look up. Within minutes, they'd gathered near the main barn. 15 men in various stages of work readiness, all openly curious about the tall woman in the brown dress walking beside their boss. "Morning," Reed called out. "Most of you saw Miss Blackwell yesterday when she arrived. Those who didn't, this is Evelyn Blackwell from Boston. We're getting married Saturday if she doesn't come to her senses before then, which means she'll be running the house,
and probably half the ranch within a month based on how quickly she identified everything I've been doing wrong. A ripple of laughter ran through the group. One of the younger hands, Evelyn thought his name might be Charlie, called out, "Does that mean we're getting real food again, boss?" "That means you might get real food if you behave yourselves and don't scare her off with your appalling table manners," Reed replied. "Miss Blackwell has medical training from a Boston hospital, so anyone who gets injured now has to answer to her instead of bleeding in silence like a dignified ranch hand." "Don't say that like it's a joke," Miguel interrupted, his voice carrying authority that made the younger men snap to attention. "Miss Blackwell, my mother Maria wants to meet you properly. She's at our cabin, just down the hill past the bunkhouse. Would you be willing to visit with her this morning while the boss shows you around?" Evelyn recognized the offer for what it was, a chance for the ranch matriarch to evaluate her without an audience of curious men. "I'd be honored," she said. "Good, I'll take you down after we're finished here." Miguel turned to Reed. "Boss, Charlie's got that mare in the north pasture that needs looking at, possible colic, and Jack says the fence on the eastern boundary is down again, probably elk going through." Reed nodded, already shifting into work mode. "I'll check the mare after I show Evelyn the operation. Jack, take Tom and fix that fence properly this time. Use the heavier gauge wire, not whatever scraps you've been making do with." The men dispersed to their tasks, and Reed led Evelyn through the complex, explaining the function of each building, the purpose of each operation. The horse barn where they bred and trained mounts for ranch work and sale. The cattle barn where they kept a small dairy herd and treated injured stock. The equipment shed filled with tools and tack and the accumulated necessities of running a large operation. The smokehouse, the root cellar, the ice house where they stored winter-cut blocks through the summer months. It was overwhelming in scope and impressive in organization. Reed moved through it all with the easy confidence of someone who'd built everything from nothing and knew each piece intimately. Men called out to him with questions or problems, and he answered with quick decision-making that suggested years of experience. This wasn't a gentleman rancher playing at frontier life. This was a working operation run by someone who understood the business from ground to summit. "The mare's in here," Reed said finally, leading her into the north pasture where a beautiful chestnut stood with her head low, clearly uncomfortable. "Charlie thinks it's colic, but I'm not convinced. Her breathing's wrong for that." Evelyn approached slowly, letting the mare catch her scent. The horse's eyes were dull, her stance defensive, her breathing shallow and pained. Not colic, then. Something respiratory, or possibly an infection. She ran her hands carefully along the mare's neck and chest, feeling for heat or swelling, and found it low on the right side. "Feel here," she directed Reed, guiding his hand to the spot. "That's heat and swelling, probably an abscess or infected wound, not colic." Reed's eyebrows climbed. "You can diagnose horses too." "Anatomy is anatomy. The principles are the same whether you're treating a person or an animal." Evelyn examined the mare more thoroughly and found the source, a deep puncture wound under the chest, probably from a sharp branch or fence post, now infected and draining poorly. She needs the wound cleaned and drained, hot compresses to draw out the infection, and someone to watch her for the next few days to make sure it doesn't spread. "Can you do it?" Reed asked. "The cleaning and draining, yes. The watching will have to be whoever's responsible for the horses." "That's Jack. I'll have him set up in here with supplies." Reed was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. "Evelyn, how much medical training do you actually have?" 3 years of intensive volunteering under 2 different physicians. I've assisted with everything from routine births to emergency amputations. The hospital didn't officially recognize my work because they don't officially employ women in medical roles, but the doctors I worked with treated me as a colleague. She straightened, meeting his gaze. "I'm not a licensed physician, but I'm probably more competent than half the frontier doctors practicing out here with minimal training and maximum confidence." "And you want to use those skills here," Reed said slowly. "Not just in emergencies, but as an actual practice." "I want to be useful," Evelyn corrected. "If that means helping with medical emergencies on the ranch, delivering babies for families in the area, treating injuries and illnesses that don't require a 60-mile trip to a drunk doctor in town, yes, I want that. But Reed, I need to know if that's something you can accept. Some men would find it improper or embarrassing, or—" "Some men are idiots," Reed interrupted. "Evelyn, If you can keep my hands healthy and working instead of laid up for weeks with infections that should have been preventable, that's not embarrassing. That's invaluable. And if word gets around that there's competent medical care at Broken Creek, that makes this ranch more attractive to families, which means better quality workers who stay longer instead of drifting. He paused. I'm speaking practically when I should probably be speaking personally. What I mean is, I think it's remarkable that you have these skills. I think you should use them however you want.
And I think any man who'd be threatened by his wife being more capable than half the doctors in the territory is too insecure to deserve her. The words settled into Evelyn's chest like a warm stone. She'd braced herself for resistance, for the same dismissive attitudes she'd faced in Boston, for having to fight for the right to be useful. Instead, Reed was offering not just acceptance, but active support. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Don't thank me for basic decency," Reed replied. "Come on, let's go get you introduced to Maria before she sends Miguel back up here to drag us both down to her cabin." Maria Reyes turned out to be a small woman with iron gray hair, sharp black eyes, and hands gnarled with arthritis that must have been agonizing. She greeted Evelyn at the door of the cabin she shared with Miguel, evaluated her with a single sweeping glance, and promptly pulled her inside. "Sit," Maria commanded, gesturing to a worn but comfortable chair. "Miguel, go away." "Reed, you too. This is women's business." "Ma, I live here," Miguel protested. "Then go live somewhere else for 30 minutes. Shoo." Maria made a shooing gesture that had both men retreating hastily. Once they were gone, she turned her full attention to Evelyn. "So, you're the Boston lady who's going to marry our foolish boss." "I'm considering it," Evelyn said carefully. "You're doing it," Maria corrected. "I saw how you looked at him this morning, and more importantly, I saw how he looked at you, like someone handed him something precious, and he's terrified he'll break it through clumsiness." She moved to pour tea, the motion clearly painful but accomplished with dignity, and set a cup in front of Evelyn. "Now tell me true, girl. Are you running from something, running to something, or both?" The directness was startling and oddly refreshing. "Both," Evelyn admitted. "My mother sent me here as a cruel joke. Reed was expecting someone else, someone beautiful and refined." "I'm neither of those things, and I'm not who was promised. But I came anyway because staying in Boston meant staying invisible forever, and I'm tired of being invisible." Maria nodded slowly. "Reed told Miguel about your mother's trick. Miguel wanted to ride to the train station and put you on the next train back to Boston before you could get hurt. I told him to shut up and wait. Anyone your mother would use as a weapon is either going to be destroyed by it or sharpened by it, and I wanted to see which kind you were." "And?" Evelyn asked. "Sharpened," Maria said with satisfaction. "Good. Reed needs sharp. He's too soft sometimes, too willing to believe the best of people who don't deserve it. He needs someone who knows what cruelty looks like and how to face it without breaking." She sipped her own tea. "I kept house for him for 2 years after he built that enormous place. Watched him try to make it ready for some fantasy woman who didn't exist. When my hands got too bad to work, I thought he'd waste away up there eating his terrible food and getting lonelier. But then Miguel told me about the letter, and I thought, maybe this time something would finally go right for that boy." "He's 35, Evelyn pointed out. "Hardly a boy." "He's my son's boss and my friend, which makes him close enough to family that I'll call him whatever I like," Maria said tartly. "Now listen, ranch life is hard. Harder than anything you've known in Boston, I expect. The winters are brutal, the isolation is real, and there will be days you want to scream from the loneliness of it. But if you and Reed build something true together, it's worth every hard day. Miguel and I have been here 20 years, and I've seen marriages crumble and marriages thrive. The ones that thrive are the ones built on partnership. Two people pulling equal weight, respecting each other's strengths, covering each other's weaknesses." "That's what I want," Evelyn said. "Partnership. To be valued for what I can do, not judged for what I'm not." Maria studied her for a long moment, then nodded decisively. "Then you'll do. Reed's a good man. Honest, fair, harder on himself than anyone else. He'll treat you right if you give him the chance. And girl, that medical training you have, use it. This territory needs capable healers more than it needs another decorative wife doing needlepoint in a fancy house." They talked for another 20 minutes, Maria offering insights about the ranch, the crew, the challenges Evelyn would face managing a large household with minimal help. By the time Miguel and Reed returned, clearly having been waiting anxiously outside, Evelyn felt she'd passed some crucial test she hadn't known she was taking. "She'll do," Maria announced to Reed. "Stop worrying like a nervous colt and marry the girl before she realizes she can do better." Reed's ears went red, but he was smiling. "Yes, ma'am. Yes." "Anything else?" "Fix that step on my porch that's been loose for 3 months, and send Charlie down to turn my garden beds before I plant. These hands won't do it anymore." Maria flexed her fingers with a grimace. "And bring your bride back to visit properly once you're settled. I want to teach her how to make proper tortillas before she ruins you with whatever Boston nonsense she was raised on." "I'll have you know Boston makes excellent," Evelyn started, then stopped at Maria's expression. "Actually, I'd love to learn. Thank you." The morning had stretched into early afternoon by the time they finally left for town. Reed hitched a team to a large wagon, helped Evelyn up to the bench seat, and they rolled out under a sky so blue it seemed impossible. The road to Copper Hollow wound through high country meadows just beginning to green with spring, past groves of aspen that whispered in the mountain breeze, alongside a creek that ran clear and cold from snowmelt. "It's beautiful," Evelyn said, and meant it with an intensity that surprised her. "Wait until you've seen it in winter," Reed replied. 6 feet of snow, temperatures cold enough to freeze your breath before it leaves your mouth, and winds that'll knock you off your feet if you're not careful. Beautiful then, too, but in a terrifying sort of way. "Tell me about winter here. What's it really like?" Reed did, and as the wagon rolled toward town, he painted a picture of frontier winters that was both honest and daunting. Cattle that had to be fed daily regardless of weather. Horses that needed to be rotated from pasture to barn. Water that froze solid and had to be broken daily. Men who got cabin fever and picked fights out of sheer boredom. The constant vigilance against frostbite, hypothermia, and the 100 other ways winter could kill the unwary or unlucky. "We lose cattle every winter," he said bluntly. "Not many if we're careful, but it happens. Wolves, weather, accidents. And every few years we lose something more valuable, a breeding stallion, a prize bull. Last year, Miguel's nephew lost 3 fingers to frostbite when he got caught out overnight fixing fence. The year before that, a seasonal hand froze to death in the line shack because he didn't understand how fast weather can turn up here." "You're trying to scare me," Evelyn observed. "I'm trying to be honest," Reed corrected. "The mountains are beautiful, Evelyn, but they're not forgiving. And ranch life doesn't stop for weather or hardship or personal crisis. The work continues regardless. If that's not something you can handle..." "Reed, I spent 3 years in a charity hospital where we treated injuries and illnesses that would make winter ranching look gentle. I've held down screaming men during amputations, delivered babies under conditions that should have killed both mother and child, and closed the eyes of more patients than I can count because we couldn't save them. I'm not afraid of hard work or harsh conditions or the reality that sometimes people die despite our best efforts." She turned to face him directly. "What I'm afraid of is wasting my life being decorative and useless when I could be doing something that matters. So stop trying to scare me off and tell me what I need to know to be genuinely useful." Reed was quiet for a long moment. Then he started talking, really talking, not managing her expectations, but sharing actual information. What supplies they'd need to stockpile for winter, how to recognize the signs of hypothermia and frostbite, which line shacks needed better equipment for emergency shelter, how they managed medical emergencies when the doctor was unreachable, the gaps in their preparation where someone with medical knowledge could make a real difference. By the time Copper Hollow appeared in the distance, a scatter of buildings huddled in a valley like civilization's last stand against wilderness, Evelyn had a clear picture of what she'd be taking on. It was daunting, yes, but also purposeful in a way that made her previous life seem like elaborate time wasting. The town itself was smaller than she'd expected. Perhaps 30 buildings total, arranged along a single main street. Reed pulled the wagon up in front of a large mercantile and helped her down, and Evelyn was immediately aware of curious eyes tracking their movement. A frontier town in spring, she realized, probably had precious little entertainment beyond gossip about who was doing what with whom. "Mrs. Chen runs the mercantile," Reed explained as they entered. "She's from San Francisco originally, came here with her husband during the Silver Rush and stayed after he died.
She'll have most of what you need, and whatever she doesn't have, she can order from Denver.
Mrs. Chen turned out to be a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who took one look at Evelyn and Reed together and smiled with unmistakable satisfaction. So the rumors are true. You actually found yourself a bride, Reed Callahan.
I did. Reed's hand found the small of Evelyn's back, a gesture that was somehow both protective and presenting.
Mrs. Chen, this is Evelyn Blackwell from Boston. We're getting married Saturday if Reverend Walsh is available. He'll make himself available for a wedding that means the territory's most eligible bachelor is finally off the market. Mrs. Chen came around the counter to shake Evelyn's hand with surprising strength. Welcome to Copper Hollow, Miss Blackwell.
What brings you to our humble mercantile? The discovery that my future husband has been surviving on salt pork and toxic coffee for the better part of a year, Evelyn replied, and was rewarded with Mrs. Chen's delighted laugh. I've been telling him that for months.
Maybe you'll have better luck reforming his bachelor habits than the rest of us. She pulled out a ledger and pencil. What do you need? The list was extensive. Flour, sugar, cornmeal, dried beans, rice, salt, baking powder, lard, coffee that Reed was forbidden from brewing unsupervised, dried fruit, canned goods, and a dozen other staples that constituted proper pantry stocking. Mrs. Chen noted everything down with efficient precision, occasionally suggesting additions or alternatives based on what worked well in high country cooking. You'll want extra yeast, she advised. Bread rises differently at altitude, and you'll go through more of it learning the timing. And Miss Blackwell, take my advice. Stock up on dried herbs and spices. They're expensive, but they're the difference between food that's edible and food that's actually worth eating. Reed's been living on the edible end of that spectrum for too long. I'm standing right here, Reed protested mildly. Then you can confirm I'm telling the truth. Mrs. Chen winked at Evelyn. He's a good man, Miss Blackwell, but he needs looking after in the domestic realm. The entire town's been hoping someone would take him in hand before he accidentally poisoned himself. They were loading the wagon with supplies. Mrs. Chen had somehow produced everything on the extensive list, plus several items she'd insisted were essential. When the sound of a horse being ridden too hard made them all turn. A young man Evelyn recognized as one of the ranch hands, Danny or David, maybe, pulled his lathered mount to a sliding stop in front of the mercantile. "Boss," he gasped, "you need to come quick. There's been an accident at the ranch." "Jack, something went wrong with the fence repair. He's hurt bad and Miguel sent me to find you and Miss Blackwell." The color drained from Reed's face. "How bad?" "Bad enough that Miguel said to bring the lady specifically. Said we needed her medical skills right now, not in an hour when we could get Jack to town." Evelyn was already moving, her mind shifting into the focused clarity that had carried her through dozens of emergencies at the hospital. "Finish loading the supplies," she directed Reed. "We need to get back as fast as these horses can manage safely. Danny, ride ahead and tell Miguel to have the following ready when we arrive. Clean water, lots of it. Clean cloths or sheets torn into strips. The sharpest knife in the bunkhouse, boiled for 5 minutes to sterilize it. And someone should heat another knife in fire until it glows red, then let it cool enough to touch. Can you remember all that?" Danny nodded, eyes wide. "Yes, ma'am." "Then go. Fast but careful. I need you arriving in one piece to relay those instructions." She turned to Reed, who was staring at her with something like awe. "How fast can we make it back?" 30 minutes if I push the team. But Evelyn, if Jack's as bad as it sounds, then 30 minutes might be the difference between keeping him alive and burying him, Evelyn finished. "So let's not waste them standing here. Move." Reed moved. Within 2 minutes, they were racing out of town, the wagon bouncing over ruts that would have seemed alarming under any other circumstances. Evelyn braced herself against the seat and ran through mental lists. What injuries were most likely from fence work? What treatment she'd need? What complications to watch for? Puncture wounds, crush injuries, arterial bleeding, all possibilities, all requiring different immediate responses. "Tell me about Jack," she said as they flew over the rough road. "How old, how strong, any existing medical conditions I should know about?" 28, strong as an ox, no health problems that I know of. Reed's voice was tight with worry. "He's been with me for 4 years. Good man, careful worker. If something went wrong badly enough to have Miguel sending for medical help, it's serious. Then we'll treat it seriously and competently, and we'll do everything possible to keep him alive. Evelyn's voice came out calmer than she felt. Reed, I need you to prepare for the possibility that I might not be able to save him. Frontier accidents are unpredictable, and there's only so much even the best medical care can do without proper facilities. But you'll try. I'll do everything I know how to do, Evelyn promised. That's all any of us can do. They made it back to the ranch in 25 minutes, Reed pushing the horses harder than was strictly safe, but not so hard they'd found her. Danny had clearly delivered the message because Miguel met them at the main barn with exactly the supplies Evelyn had requested, his face grim. He's in the barn, Miguel said. Fence post fell wrong when they were setting it, caught him across the chest and drove him backward onto a pile of cut wire. Bad puncture wound to the abdomen, possibly internal damage. He's conscious, but in shock. Evelyn was already striding toward the barn, Reed close behind her. Inside she found Jack lying on a makeshift pallet, his face gray with pain and shock, his shirt soaked with blood. Tom knelt beside him, pressing a cloth to Jack's abdomen with shaking hands, and several other hands clustered nearby looking helpless and terrified. One look told Evelyn everything she needed to know. Deep puncture wound, lower right abdomen, almost certainly penetrating the peritoneal cavity. High risk of intestinal perforation, infection, and fatal bleeding. In Boston, with proper surgical facilities, this would be challenging. Here, with improvised tools and no anesthesia, it might be impossible. But impossible had never stopped her before. Everyone out except Reed and Miguel, she commanded, her voice carrying authority that sent the other men scrambling. I need space to work, and I need it now. She knelt beside Jack, meeting his pain-glazed eyes with calm she didn't feel. Jack, I'm going to help you. This is going to hurt worse before it gets better, but I need you to stay conscious and stay still. Can you do that for me? Yes, ma'am, Jack whispered. Good man. She turned to Reed. I need your hands and your steadiest nerve. Miguel, you're going to help hold him still when the pain gets bad. This is going to be rough. Then Evelyn Blackwell, who'd spent 3 years preparing for exactly this moment without knowing it, rolled up her sleeves and got to work. The world narrowed to the wound, the blood, and the desperate race to save a life before it bled away into the straw. Everything she'd learned in 3 years of hospital work, every skill she'd absorbed from physicians who'd treated her as a colleague, every ounce of stubborn determination that had carried her from Boston to this barn in the Colorado high country, all of it came together in her hands as she worked to prove that plain Evelyn Blackwell, the unwanted daughter, the cruel joke, was worth exactly as much as she'd always believed. Worth choosing, worth trusting, worth the life she was finally allowed to build. The wound was worse than she'd hoped, but not as catastrophic as she'd feared. The wire had punched through muscle and fascia, but had miraculously missed the major blood vessels and, as far as she could tell with careful probing, had only grazed the intestine rather than puncturing it fully. Still serious, still potentially fatal if infection set in, but survivable if she could clean it properly and close it before shock or blood loss became irreversible. Reed, I need your hands here, Evelyn said, guiding his fingers to apply pressure on either side of the wound. Feel that? You're closing off the smaller vessels. Hold exactly that pressure, not harder, not lighter. Miguel, get behind him and brace his shoulders. When I start cleaning this, he's going to try to move, and he cannot move. Understand? Miguel positioned himself, his weathered hands gentle but immovable on Jack's shoulders. I understand, señorita. Jack, look at me. Evelyn waited until his pain-glazed eyes focused on her face. I'm going to clean this wound, and it's going to hurt worse than anything you've felt so far. You're going to want to scream, and that's fine. Scream all you want, but you cannot move. Moving could tear something inside that can't be repaired. Can you do that? I can do it, Jack whispered, though his face had gone the color of old paper. Evelyn took the sterilized knife and began the brutal work of debriding the wound, cutting away contaminated tissue, flushing the wound with clean water until she could see clearly what she was working with, removing fragments of wire and cloth that had been driven deep by the impact. Jack did scream, a sound that echoed in the barn and brought men running to the door where Tom stopped them with a harsh command to stay back. Reed's hands never wavered, holding exactly the pressure she'd shown him, his face set in lines of concentration that suggested he was channeling all his fear and worry into this single task. Miguel kept Jack pinned with the efficiency of long experience holding down injured animals, murmuring words of encouragement in Spanish that Jack probably couldn't hear but seemed to help anyway. "The intestines grazed but not perforated," Evelyn announced after what felt like hours but was probably closer to 20 minutes. "That's good. We don't have to go deeper. But this needs to be closed in layers, and I need better light. Reed, can someone rig more lanterns?" "Tom," Reed called without looking away from the wound. "More lanterns around Miss Blackwell. Move." Tom appeared with lanterns that cast harsh yellow light over the improvised surgery. Evelyn threaded the needle she'd had boiled, thick thread meant for leather work, far from ideal, but better than nothing, and began the painstaking work of closing Jack from the inside out. First the deepest layer, pulling together fascia with stitches that would have to hold until the tissue knit itself. Then the muscle, trying to align fibers that had been torn and traumatized. Finally the skin, each stitch precise despite her hands growing tired and Jack's breathing becoming increasingly shallow. "Stay with me, Jack," she said as she worked. "You're doing beautifully, almost done." "Awful lot of blood for almost done," Jack managed, and Evelyn felt a surge of hope because anyone who could make jokes was probably not dying imminently. "Blood makes everything look more dramatic," she replied, tying off the last stitch. "Reed, I need those heated knives now. And Jack, this is going to hurt worse than the cleaning did, but it'll be fast." Sut. The cauterization was brutal and necessary, sealing smaller vessels that were still oozing, preventing the slow bleeding that could kill him over hours instead of minutes. Jack's scream this time was weaker, his body trembling with shock and exhaustion. Evelyn worked as fast as she dared, then finally sat back on her heels, her hands shaking now that the immediate crisis had passed. "It's done," she said. "Miguel, we need to keep him warm and still. Reed, I need a clean space where I can monitor him, somewhere near the house if possible. He'll need to be watched constantly for the next 48 hours for signs of infection or internal bleeding." "The downstairs guest room," Reed said immediately. "It's off the kitchen, easy to reach, warm. Miguel, get Charlie and Danny to help you move him. Carefully." "Miss Blackwell." "How carefully?" "Like he's made of spun glass and filled with nitroglycerin," Evelyn replied. "Any jostling could tear those internal stitches. Slow, steady, smooth as you can manage." It took 15 minutes to move Jack from the barn to the house, 4 men carrying the pallet with such care that the transfer looked like some strange ceremonial procession. Evelyn walked beside him, one hand on his wrist monitoring his pulse, watching his color for signs of deterioration. By the time they had him settled in the guest room with clean sheets and enough blankets to combat shock, full night had fallen and Evelyn's hands had finally stopped shaking. Reed appeared in the doorway with coffee, properly brewed for once, and a sandwich that looked hastily assembled but edible. "You should eat," he said quietly, "and probably sit down before you fall down." "I need to stay with Jack. His pulse is weak and his breathing is shallow. He's not out of danger yet." "Then you'll stay with Jack while sitting in that chair and eating that sandwich, because passing out from exhaustion won't help anyone." Reed set the coffee and food on the bedside table, then dragged a comfortable chair to the bedside. "I'll stay too. Between the two of us, we can keep watch." Evelyn wanted to argue, but found she didn't have the energy. She sank into the chair and picked up the sandwich, realizing she hadn't eaten since breakfast. Her hands were stained with blood that she'd need to scrub off, her brown dress was ruined beyond repair, and every muscle in her body ached from the sustained tension of the last few hours. But Jack was alive, his chest rising and falling with reasonable regularity, and that was what mattered. "You were remarkable," Reed said softly. "I've never seen anything like that. The way you just knew what to do, how to cut, where to stitch, what to watch for. It was like watching someone who'd done this 100 times. "I have done this dozens of times," Evelyn replied. "Maybe not exactly this, but close enough. Puncture wounds, stab wounds, industrial accidents where men got caught in machinery. The hospital saw it all, and I saw most of it alongside the doctors I trained with." She sipped the coffee, grateful for its warmth and surprising drinkability. "Reed, I need to be honest with you. Jack should survive this if infection doesn't set in, but there's no guarantee. The next 48 hours are critical. If he develops fever, if his abdomen becomes rigid, if he shows signs of peritonitis, I might not be able to save him." "But you gave him a chance," Reed said. "Without you, he'd already be dead or dying. Miguel was ready to put him in a wagon and try to get him to town, which would have killed him from the jostling before we made it halfway. You gave him a fighting chance, Evelyn. That's more than any of us could have done." They sat in companionable silence, taking turns checking Jack's pulse and breathing, watching for any change in his condition. Around midnight, Miguel appeared with Maria, who took one look at the sleeping man and then at Evelyn and made a soft sound of approval. "The boys told me what you did," Maria said. "Told me you worked on him like you'd been doing ranch surgery your whole life. Jack's a good man. His mother will be grateful you saved her son." "He's not saved yet," Evelyn cautioned. "The next 2 days will tell us if this holds." "It'll hold," Maria said with certainty. "I've seen enough injuries on this ranch to know the difference between good work and desperate hope. What you did was good work." She turned to Reed. "You should marry this one quick before she realizes she can do better than a rancher who can't cook and builds houses too big for his britches." Reed smiled tiredly. "Working on it, Maria. We're supposed to get married Saturday if—" He stopped, looking at Evelyn. "If you still want to. I'd understand if you wanted to postpone until Jack's in the clear, or indefinitely, given what you've just been through." Evelyn looked at Jack, peacefully unconscious after his ordeal. Looked at Maria, who'd accepted her with the pragmatic warmth of someone who valued capability over pedigree. Looked at Reed, who'd held his steady pressure for over an hour without complaint, and was offering to postpone their wedding without a hint of resentment. Looked at her own blood-stained hands and ruined dress, and the medical supplies scattered around the room where she'd just fought death to a standstill. This was real. All of it. The work, the risk, the partnership Reed was offering, the life she could build here, where being useful mattered more than being decorative. Boston and her mother's cruel joke felt like something that had happened to a different person in a different lifetime. "We're getting married Saturday," she said firmly. "Jack will either be stable enough that I can leave him for a few hours, or he won't be and we'll postpone. But I'm not postponing indefinitely, and I'm not reconsidering. Reed Callahan, you asked me what I wanted, and I've decided I want this. All of this. The ranch, the medical emergencies, the terrible coffee I'll spend the rest of my life trying to fix, and the partnership with someone who trusts me to save his men's lives and doesn't flinch when I get blood all over his guest room." Maria laughed outright. "Told you she was sharpened, not broken. All right, you two keep watch tonight. I'll be back in the morning to sit with Jack so you can both get proper rest. And Miss Blackwell, Evelyn, welcome to Broken Creek. You're going to fit in just fine." She swept out, taking Miguel with her, leaving Reed and Evelyn alone with the sleeping man between them. Reed reached across the bed, offering his hand, and Evelyn took it, their fingers interlacing in a grip that felt like promise and partnership and the beginning of something worth building. "Thank you," Reed said quietly, "for saving Jack, for staying, for being exactly who you are instead of who you thought you should be." "Thank you for asking what I wanted," Evelyn replied. "No one ever asked me that before." They sat through the night, taking turns dozing in the chair while the other kept watch. Jack's breathing remained steady, his pulse weak but present, his color gradually improving from gray to merely pale. By dawn, Evelyn felt confident enough to pronounce him out of immediate danger, though she warned Reed that infection remained a serious risk for the next several days. "I'll need to change his dressings twice daily and watch for any signs of fever or inflammation," she explained as they finally left the room to let Maria take over the watch. "If we're lucky and I did everything right, he'll be up and complaining about being bedridden within a week. If we're unlucky, then we'll deal with it when and if it happens," Reed interrupted gently. "For now, you need sleep. Real sleep in a real bed, not 10-minute intervals in a chair. Come on." He led her upstairs to her room, and Evelyn was suddenly aware of how thoroughly disreputable she must look. Dress stained beyond redemption, hair falling from its pins, face probably smudged with the same blood that caked her hands. She should have been embarrassed. Instead, she felt oddly proud, like she'd finally earned the right to look this disheveled through honest work that mattered. "I'll bring hot water for washing," Reed said. "And Evelyn, you saved a man's life yesterday. Whatever else happens, remember that. You've been here less than 2 full days, and you've already made a difference that will ripple through this entire community. Jack has family in town, friends throughout the territory. Word will spread that there's competent medical care at Broken Creek, and that will change things. Bring in better workers, help more people, build something that matters." He paused at the door. "You matter, Evelyn. I hope you're starting to believe that." She was. Against all expectation and years of evidence to the contrary, she was starting to believe it. The hot water arrived minutes later, delivered by Charlie with wide-eyed respect that suggested the story of last night's surgery had already spread through the bunkhouse. Evelyn washed methodically, scrubbing blood from her hands and arms, unpinning her hair and running a cloth through it to remove the worst of the grime. Her brown dress was ruined, but she had others, and somehow the loss didn't feel tragic. That dress had been chosen by her mother to make her invisible. The next dress she wore would be her own choice, and it didn't have to be brown. She slept for 6 hours straight, the deep, dreamless sleep of utter exhaustion, and woke to afternoon sunlight and the smell of something cooking that actually smelled edible. Downstairs, she found Reed in the kitchen attempting what looked like stew, Maria supervising from a chair by the window, and Jack still sleeping peacefully in the guest room with Danny keeping watch. "He woke up an hour ago," Maria reported, "asked for water, drank half a cup, and went back to sleep. His breathing is good, no fever yet. I think your work is going to hold." "Don't celebrate yet," Evelyn cautioned, but she felt a surge of relief so intense it was almost painful. "We're not clear for another 24 to 48 hours. "Always so cautious," Maria teased. "This is good. Doctors should be cautious. But you can also celebrate small victories. The man is alive who should be dead. That's worth acknowledging." Reed appeared from the kitchen, spoon in hand. "I'm attempting to make actual food instead of burning things beyond recognition. Would you be willing to supervise before I accidentally poison us all?" The stew was actually decent, requiring only minor corrections to become genuinely good. They ate together at the kitchen table, Reed, Evelyn, Maria, and Miguel, who'd appeared at some point, and the conversation flowed easily around ranch business, Jack's continued recovery, and the wedding that was supposedly happening in 2 days. "Reverend Walsh confirmed Saturday afternoon," Reed said. "I sent Danny to town this morning to check. He'll do the ceremony at the ranch if you'd prefer that to the church. Figured Jack could attend from his sickbed if he's feeling up to it." "Here would be better," Evelyn agreed. "Keep it simple and small. Just the people who actually matter." "The whole crew will want to attend," Miguel said. "You saved one of their own. That makes you family in their eyes, not just the boss's wife. Fair warning, ranch families take care of their own, which means you'll have 15 men and their assorted relatives watching your back from now on." The thought should have been overwhelming. Instead, it felt like belonging, the kind Evelyn had only ever experienced briefly at the hospital, where competence earned respect regardless of pedigree or appearance. Here, she'd proven herself in the most direct way possible, and the acceptance that followed was genuine rather than grudging. "I can live with that," she said. The next day and a half passed in a blur of checking on Jack, whose condition continued to improve despite Evelyn's cautious monitoring, preparing the house for a wedding, and dealing with the steady stream of ranch hands who found reasons to pass by the kitchen where Evelyn was working. Each one managed to convey gratitude for saving Jack, usually through awkward offerings of wildflowers, fresh eggs, or in one memorable case, a jar of honey that Tom swore came from his own hives, and definitely wasn't stolen from the mercantile in town. "They're courting your approval," Reed explained, watching Tom flee after presenting the honey. "You're about to become the most important woman on this ranch, possibly in this entire section of the territory. Medical care, household management, the boss's ear, you'll have more practical power than you realize." "I just want to be useful," Evelyn protested. "You're already far past useful and well into essential," Reed replied. "Which reminds me, we need to talk about something. It's going to sound presumptuous, but hear me out." He led her to his office, a small room off the parlor that was clearly his actual working space, rather than any of the formal rooms he'd built for show. The desk was covered in ledgers and correspondence, the walls hung with maps of the ranch and surrounding territory. "Broken Creek is profitable," Reed began without preamble. "Not spectacularly so, but enough that we're comfortable and growing steadily. I own the land outright, no mortgages, no debts. The accounts are all documented here." He gestured to the ledgers.
and I want you to have full access to them, not because I expect you to manage the books, though you're welcome to if you want, but because partners should know where they stand financially." Evelyn blinked, surprised. In Boston, a man's financial affairs were kept private even from his wife, unless circumstances forced disclosure. "Reed, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do. I told you I wanted partnership, and partnership means transparency. You should know what we have, what we owe, what we're building toward. And Evelyn," he pulled out a document, "I had a lawyer in Denver draw this up.
It's a legal agreement that puts half the ranch in your name upon marriage. Not contingent on anything, not revocable except by your consent. Half of everything, legally yours, so you're never dependent or trapped or—" "You barely know me," Evelyn interrupted, staring at the document like it might bite her. "Reed, we're getting married in less than 24 hours. What if I'm secretly terrible? What if I run the ranch into the ground or decide I hate frontier life and abandon you? What if you're exactly who you've shown me you are, honest, capable, and willing to work yourself to exhaustion saving people you barely know?" Reed countered. "Evelyn, I'm not risking anything I wouldn't gladly give. You've already proven yourself worth 10 times what I'm offering. This is just making the partnership legal and binding so you have security regardless of what happens." She looked at the document again, seeing her name written there beside Reed's, Evelyn Blackwell Callahan, joint owner of 30,000 acres and everything built upon them. It was more than financial security. It was validation, recognition, proof that she mattered in ways that had nothing to do with her appearance or her mother's approval. "All right," she said quietly. "Thank you." "Don't thank me for doing the bare minimum of treating you fairly," Reed said, echoing his words from days ago. Then he smiled. "Besides, you're marrying me. That's thanks enough." Saturday dawned clear and beautiful, the kind of perfect spring day that seemed ordered specifically for significant occasions. Jack was awake and alert, his color nearly normal, his wound showing no signs of infection despite Evelyn's continued vigilant monitoring. Maria had arranged wildflowers throughout the house. The crew had cleaned up the immediate grounds until they looked almost civilized, and Reverend Walsh arrived at noon with his Bible and a knowing smile. "I heard about the surgery," he said to Evelyn. "Jack's mother came to thank me for praying for her son, but I told her to save her thanks for you. I've seen trained doctors lose patients with less serious injuries than what you treated. Whatever you learned in Boston, we're grateful you brought it here." The ceremony itself was simple and brief, conducted in the parlor with the entire crew crowded in to witness. Evelyn wore a new dress, pale blue instead of brown, purchased hastily from Mrs. Chen during yesterday's supply run, and Reed wore his best suit that still somehow looked like it belonged on a working rancher rather than a formal gentleman. Maria stood beside Evelyn and Miguel beside Reed, and when the Reverend asked if they both chose this freely, their simultaneous yes carried the weight of certainty earned rather than assumed. "Then by the authority vested in me by the Colorado Territory, I pronounce you husband and wife. Reed, you may kiss your bride." Reed's kiss was gentle and brief, appropriate for a public setting, but Evelyn felt it down to her toes. This was real, legally binding. She was married to a man she'd known less than a week, and somehow it felt exactly right. The celebration afterward was louder and more enthusiastic than Evelyn had expected, the crew breaking out instruments and playing music while Maria and several ranch wives produced enough food for a proper feast. Even Jack managed to sit up and raise a glass of water to toast the couple who'd gotten married partly because one of them had saved his life. "To the boss and his lady," Jack called out, his voice still weak but his grin genuine. "May they live long, prosper greatly, and never let the boss near a stove unsupervised." The laughter that followed was warm and inclusive, and Evelyn felt something in her chest loosen that had been tight for 23 years. This was family, not the kind she'd been born into, but the kind she'd chosen and been chosen by. These people respected her not because of her name or her appearance, but because she'd proven herself useful and trustworthy when it mattered. As the sun set and the celebration wound down, Reed pulled her aside to the porch, where they could watch the mountains turn purple with distance. "Happy?" he asked quietly. "Terrified," Evelyn admitted. "But yes, happy. This is the first time in my life I've made a choice this big and felt certain it was right." "It is right," Reed said with confidence. "We're going to build something remarkable here, Evelyn. Not because it'll be easy or because we won't face challenges, but because we're both stubborn enough to refuse to fail." He took her hand. "Thank you for taking a chance on a lonely rancher with terrible coffee and an overbuilt house." "Thank you for asking what I wanted," Evelyn replied, "and for listening to the answer." They stood together as night fell over Broken Creek Ranch, watching stars emerge in numbers that Boston never saw through its industrial haze. Somewhere in the guest room, Jack slept peacefully with Danny keeping watch. In the bunkhouse, the crew was probably still celebrating with the enthusiasm of people who'd witnessed something rare and worth marking. And in Boston, Constance Blackwell had no idea that her cruel joke had transformed into exactly the kind of partnership and purpose she'd tried so hard to deny her daughter. The wedding night was quiet and careful, two people learning each other with the awkwardness that came from genuine feeling rather than practiced performance. Reed was patient and surprisingly gentle for someone who'd built his life through hard work and harder conditions. Evelyn found herself grateful for his honesty about his own inexperience, for his willingness to admit uncertainty instead of pretending expertise he didn't possess. "Is this all right?" he asked at one point, and Evelyn appreciated the question more than any smooth assurance could have meant. "It's all right," she confirmed. "Reed, we don't have to rush this. We have time." "We have the rest of our lives," Reed agreed, and the simple certainty in his voice made Evelyn's eyes sting with unexpected tears. They fell asleep tangled together in Reed's bed, their bed now, listening to the ranch settle into night around them. And if it wasn't the romantic fantasy Boston novels described, it was something better, real, honest, and built on mutual respect instead of performance. The next morning brought the first test of their new partnership. Jack's fever spiked overnight, not dangerously, but enough that Evelyn spent 3 hours at his bedside monitoring symptoms and praying the infection she'd feared wouldn't develop into something unmanageable. Reed sat with her, trusting her judgment completely, offering help when she needed it and staying quiet when she needed to think. By noon, the fever had broken naturally, and Evelyn felt confident enough to pronounce Jack on the road to genuine recovery. The relief was overwhelming, but there was no time to celebrate because Miguel appeared with news that one of the seasonal hands had broken his arm in 3 places and needed immediate treatment. "Can't wait for town," Miguel explained. "Bones visible through the skin and bleeding significant. We need you now if we want to save the arm." Evelyn looked at Reed, who nodded immediately. "Go. I'll watch Jack." So she went, treating her second serious injury in 4 days, setting bones with improvised splints and stitching wounds with the same thick thread she'd used on Jack. Word spread faster than wildfire. Broken Creek Ranch had competent medical care, real care, the kind that saved lives and limbs that would have been lost to infection or incompetence. By the end of their first week as husband and wife, Evelyn had treated 7 injuries, delivered advice on a dozen minor ailments, and established herself as the de facto medical authority for the entire region. Ranch families started showing up at the door, asking shyly if Mrs. Callahan might look at a sick child or an infected wound or a suspicious growth that probably wasn't anything, but would she mind checking anyway? Reed watched this transformation with undisguised pride, supporting her work without question, building her a proper treatment room in one of the downstairs spaces, ordering medical supplies from Denver at her direction. The house that had been too big and too empty was suddenly full of purpose, people coming and going at all hours seeking help that Evelyn was finally allowed to provide without restriction or apology. 3 weeks into their marriage, a letter arrived from Boston. Evelyn recognized her mother's handwriting and felt her stomach clench with old familiar dread. She opened it alone in the kitchen, steeling herself for whatever new cruelty Constance had devised. What she found instead was something far more satisfying than any revenge she could have imagined. The letter was brief, almost curt, and dripped with barely concealed fury. Mrs. Hartford had apparently spread the story of the bride substitution throughout Boston society, presenting it as a hilarious anecdote about frontier desperation. Except the story hadn't landed as Constance had intended. Instead of laughing at Reed Callahan for being tricked into accepting damaged goods, Boston society had turned on the Blackwells for their cruelty. The letter detailed the fallout with vicious precision. Serena's engagement to Thomas Hampton had collapsed when his family declared they wanted no association with people capable of such calculated meanness. Other families had followed suit, withdrawing invitations and cutting social ties. The Blackwells, who'd built their position on careful cultivation of relationships, found themselves suddenly isolated. And worst of all, from Constance's perspective, people were talking, not about poor Reed Callahan and his unfortunate bride, but about brilliant Evelyn Blackwell, who'd escaped her terrible family and was apparently thriving as a respected medical practitioner in Colorado Territory. The final paragraph made Evelyn laugh out loud. Given the unfortunate circumstances and the distance between us, perhaps it would be best if we visited the ranch this summer to repair our relationship. I'm certain Mr. Callahan would appreciate the opportunity to know his wife's family better, and Serena is eager to see how you've settled into frontier life. Let me guess, Reed said, appearing in the doorway. Your mother wants to visit? She wants to pretend the last 23 years didn't happen and present herself as the supportive parent who always believed in me, Evelyn translated. Also, she's facing social isolation in Boston and thinks associating with our success might rehabilitate her reputation. Are you going to let her visit? Reed asked carefully. Evelyn looked at the letter again, seeing through the careful phrasing to the desperation beneath. Constance was facing the same exile she'd subjected Evelyn to for years, and the irony was almost too perfect. Almost. No, she said finally. I'm going to write back and tell her that while I appreciate her interest, Broken Creek Ranch is currently too busy providing essential medical services to the community to accommodate social visitors. I'll suggest she try again in a few years, by which time we'll hopefully be slightly less essential, and she'll hopefully have learned that cruelty has consequences. Reed's smile was slow and deeply satisfied. You're magnificent, you know that? I'm learning, Evelyn replied. And she was learning that she could be strong without being cruel, successful without being vindictive, happy without needing her mother's approval. Learning that the life she'd chosen was worth every risk, every uncertainty, every moment of terror that came with leaping into the unknown. She wrote the letter that afternoon, brief and polite, and absolutely final in its rejection. Sent it off with Danny when he made the weekly mail run to town. And then she went back to work, checking on recovering patients, treating new injuries, building the medical practice that was becoming her life's work and the ranch's greatest asset. Boston and its cruelties faded further into irrelevance with each passing day, replaced by the reality of partnership, purpose, and the profound satisfaction of being genuinely needed. The cruel joke had failed spectacularly, just as Maria had predicted. And Evelyn Blackwell Callahan was finally home. Summer arrived with the kind of heat that turned the high country meadows gold and made the creek run low enough that the ranch hands had to work twice as hard to keep the cattle watered. Evelyn's medical practice had grown beyond anything she'd imagined in those first desperate weeks. What had started as emergency treatment for ranch injuries had evolved into a genuine frontier practice serving families from a 30-mile radius. The treatment room Reed had built for her was in constant use. Mothers brought children with fevers and coughs. Men came in with injuries from mining accidents or logging mishaps. Women appeared quietly at the kitchen door, asking about ailments they were too embarrassed to discuss with Doc Patterson, who drank too much and gossiped more. Evelyn treated them all with the same careful attention she'd learned at Boston Charity Hospital, and word continued to spread that Mrs. Callahan at Broken Creek Ranch was worth the ride. You're going to need help, Reed observed one evening in late June, watching Evelyn inventory her rapidly depleting medical supplies. You're seeing 20 patients a week minimum, plus handling ranch emergencies. That's too much for one person. I can manage, Evelyn said automatically, then stopped at Reed's expression. They'd been married 3 months now, long enough that she was learning to recognize when he was about to make a point she needed to hear. What are you thinking? I'm thinking there's a young woman in town, Sarah Mitchell, the minister's daughter, who's been pestering Reverend Walsh about becoming a nurse. She's bright, eager, and currently wasting her education keeping house for her father who doesn't particularly need or appreciate the help. What if we offered her a position here? Room, board, and a small salary in exchange for assisting you with patients and learning proper medical practice? It was a good idea, practical and forward-thinking in the way Evelyn had come to expect from her husband. You'd be comfortable having another woman living in the house? Evelyn, this house has 10 bedrooms and currently uses 3 of them. We have space. And more importantly, you need the help. You're working yourself to exhaustion trying to treat everyone who shows up, and that's not sustainable. Reed crossed to where she stood and turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. Let me help you build this properly. Not just as an emergency service, but as an actual medical practice with staff and organization and the resources to do it right. That would cost money, Evelyn pointed out. Supplies, salary, possibly building a dedicated clinic space instead of using the house. We have the money. The ranch is more profitable than it's ever been, partly because having medical care on site means we lose less time to injuries and sickness. The hands heal faster, work better, and we're attracting higher quality seasonal workers because families know their people will be taken care of if something goes wrong. Reed smiled. You're not just my wife, Evelyn. You're a business asset, the best investment I've ever made, and I made it because you showed up honest and capable instead of beautiful and useless. I'm not entirely useless in the beauty department, Evelyn protested, surprised to find she was smiling. 3 months of being valued for her skills instead of judged for her appearance had done something remarkable to her confidence. You're beautiful when you don't realize anyone's watching, Reed said quietly. When you're focused on work and your face loses that guarded expression you learned in Boston. When you laugh at something Charlie said or argue with Miguel about the best treatment for saddle sores. That's when I see you clearly, and what I see is remarkable. The words settled into Evelyn's chest like warm stones. She'd spent so long believing she was plain, had it reinforced so consistently by her mother and Boston society, that genuine compliments still surprised her. But Reed wasn't performing. He meant it with the same straightforward honesty he brought to everything else. All right, she said. Talk to Sarah Mitchell. If she's serious about learning medicine, I'll teach her properly. But Reed, I need to be clear. I'm not just training her to assist me. I'm training her to be competent in her own right, to think independently and make good decisions under pressure. That means giving her real responsibility, not just having her fetch supplies and clean instruments. Good, Reed said simply. That's exactly what she needs and what this territory needs.
Train her right, and maybe she'll train others eventually. Build something that outlasts us both. Sarah Mitchell arrived a week later with a single trunk and an eagerness that reminded Evelyn of herself at 18, hungry for purpose and terrified of failing. She was 19, blonde and slight and stronger than she looked, with quick hands and a mind that absorbed information like paper absorbing ink. Within a month, she was handling routine consultations under Evelyn's supervision, and within 2 months, she was competent enough to treat minor injuries independently. You're a natural, Evelyn told her after Sarah had successfully set a broken finger on a ranch hand who'd caught it in a gate latch. Better than some of the physicians I trained with in Boston. Sarah's face flushed with pleasure. Really? Because I keep worrying I'm going to do something catastrophically wrong and kill someone. That worry means you're taking it seriously, which is good. Overconfidence kills more patients than uncertainty. Evelyn cleaned and stored the splinting materials they'd used. But Sarah, you need to trust your training. You know what you're doing. I've made sure of that. The next step is believing it yourself. The practice continued to grow through the summer. Evelyn delivered 3 babies, all successful, all healthy, all mothers and infants surviving when frontier odds suggested at least one should have been lost. She treated a logger who'd nearly severed his leg with an axe, spending 6 hours in surgery that left her hands cramping and her vision blurred, but the man alive and his legs saved. She diagnosed a child's appendicitis before it ruptured and got him to Doc Patterson in town fast enough that the surgery, for all Patterson's drinking, was successful. Each success built her reputation further, and the steady stream of patients became something approaching a flood. Reed responded by converting one of the outbuildings into a dedicated clinic space, 2 treatment rooms, a recovery area, and storage for the ever-expanding collection of medical supplies he ordered from Denver and San Francisco. By August, Evelyn was running what amounted to a small frontier hospital, and the ranch was becoming known throughout the territory as the place to go when medical care was needed immediately. You've done in 6 months what takes most doctors years to build, Doc Patterson told her during one of his rare, sober visits to consult on a difficult case. He'd ridden out from town to help with a breech birth that had required both their skills to resolve safely.
I'm not ashamed to admit you're better at this than I am, Mrs. Callahan. Younger, sharper, and considerably more sober. If you ever want to take over my practice in town, I'll retire tomorrow and die happy knowing the territory's in good hands."
"I'm happy where I am," Evelyn replied, but the compliment warmed her more than she'd expected. "Though, if you ever need someone to cover for you in emergencies, Sarah's getting competent enough to handle routine cases." "Train her well," Patterson said. "Train a dozen like her. The frontier eats doctors alive. Drink, exhaustion, the sheer impossibility of caring for too many people across too much distance. We need more healers who can share the burden." It was good advice, and Evelyn took it seriously. By fall, she'd brought on a second assistant, Maria's niece Rosa, who had a gift for comforting frightened children and steady hands for delicate work. The three of them formed a team that could handle most emergencies and many routine cases, freeing Evelyn to focus on the most serious patients and to continue expanding her own knowledge through the medical journals Reed ordered from back east. The ranch prospered alongside the medical practice.
Reed's investment in proper care for his workers paid dividends in loyalty and productivity. Men who might have drifted after their contracts expired stayed on, bringing families who settled in the area and contributed to the growing community. Broken Creek Ranch became more than just a cattle operation. It became a center of stability in a region where stability was rare and valuable. In September, a second letter arrived from Boston. This time it was from Serena, written in her flowing script on paper that smelled faintly of the lilac perfume she'd always worn. "Dearest Evelyn, I know I have no right to write to you after my silence when Mother sent you away. I should have spoken up, should have defended you, should have done 1,000 things I was too weak and frightened to attempt. I was a coward, and you paid the price for my cowardice. I'm writing now because I need you to know what's happened here. The scandal Mother created has destroyed our social position completely. No one will receive us. The invitations have stopped, the visiting has ended, and we are as isolated as I imagine you once felt in our house. Mother is bitter and furious, blaming everyone but herself. She talks constantly about how ungrateful you are, how you should be thanking her for the opportunity she gave you, how your success is somehow proof of her generosity. But Evelyn, I've been reading the letters from Mrs. Hartford's nephew, the ones where he writes about the remarkable Mrs. Callahan, who runs a medical practice and saves lives and is respected throughout the territory. He writes about you with the kind of admiration Mother always reserved for people she considered her superiors. He writes about you as someone who matters. I'm so proud of you, and so ashamed of myself for not being brave enough to support you when it would have cost me something to do so. Mother still talks about visiting, about repairing our relationship, about how family should support family. She doesn't mean it. She means she wants to bask in your success and pretend she always believed in you. I'm telling you this so you'll be prepared if she actually follows through on her threats to travel west. You don't owe us anything, Evelyn. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, not even acknowledgement. But I wanted you to know that at least one person in this house is genuinely happy that you escaped and built something remarkable from the ruins of Mother's cruelty. Your sister, Serena." Evelyn read the letter twice, feeling complicated emotions she didn't quite know how to process. Anger at Serena's complicity, yes, but also a reluctant sympathy for someone who was only now learning what it meant to be on the receiving end of social exile. And underneath it all, a deep satisfaction that the consequences Constance had worked so hard to avoid had finally caught up with her. "News from Boston?" Reed asked, appearing in the doorway of their bedroom where Evelyn had retreated to read in private. Serena wrote, "Apparently the scandal is complete. They're completely isolated socially, and my mother is as bitter as you'd expect." Evelyn handed him the letter. "She's warning me that Constance might actually try to visit." Reed read quickly, his expression darkening. "Your mother sounds charming, and delusional if she thinks we'd welcome her after what she did. The question is whether we'd refuse her outright or let her come and make herself uncomfortable with the reality of ranch life," Evelyn said. "There's a certain appeal to watching her struggle with actual work and frontier conditions after years of Boston comfort. There's also the risk that she'd upset you, undermine your confidence, and generally make everyone miserable with her presence," Reed countered. "Evelyn, you don't owe her anything. Not hospitality, not forgiveness, not even basic courtesy given how she treated you. If you want to refuse her, we refuse her. If you want to let her come and prove she's learned nothing, We can do that too. But make the decision based on what you want, not what you think you should want. It was the same question he'd asked her on the train platform 6 months ago, and it still cut through all the complexity to the essential truth. What did she want? I want her to understand what she threw away, Evelyn said slowly. I want her to see what I've built here, who I've become, what I'm worth to this community. I want her to face the reality that her cruelty didn't break me, it freed me. But Reed, I don't know if that's worth the cost of having her here, disrupting our lives and probably saying awful things disguised as concern. Then let's make it conditional, Reed suggested. Write back to Serena, not your mother, your sister, who at least has the grace to be ashamed. Tell her that Constance can visit for exactly 1 week in late October, after the harvest, and before winter sets in. She'll stay in the guest room, she'll observe how we live without interfering, and she'll leave at the end of the week regardless of whether she's ready or comfortable. No extended visits, no dramatic reconciliations, just a brief window for her to see what she created and then go back to Boston with that knowledge. It was perfect, bounded, controlled, giving Evelyn the satisfaction of proving her success without surrendering months of her life to her mother's presence. You're brilliant, she told Reed. Has anyone mentioned that recently? You mention it occasionally, usually when I'm not burning food or making toxic coffee, Reed replied with a grin. Write the letter. Make it clear this is a one-time offer with strict conditions. And Evelyn, I'll be with you the entire time. If she says one thing that crosses the line, I'll personally put her on the eastbound train regardless of what she wants. The letter to Serena was carefully worded, not warm, but not cruel, laying out the conditions for a visit with precision that left no room for negotiation. Constance could come in late October for 1 week. She would stay at the ranch, observe their life, and then leave. No extensions, no drama, no attempts to interfere with the medical practice or ranch operations. If she couldn't agree to those terms, she shouldn't bother making the journey. Serena's response came 6 weeks later, confirming that Constance had agreed to the conditions with barely concealed fury at being dictated to by the daughter she'd tried to discard. They would arrive on October 20th and stay exactly 1 week as specified. Serena's postscript was brief. Thank you for giving us this chance, even though we don't deserve it. I promise to keep Mother in check as much as I'm able. October 20th dawned cold and clear, the first real hint of the brutal winter Reed had warned her about months ago. Evelyn woke early, treating 3 patients before breakfast, a ranch hand with an infected cut, a neighbor's child with a persistent cough, and a pregnant woman checking in for her routine examination. The work steadied her nerves, reminded her who she'd become in the 6 months since leaving Boston. By the time the afternoon train arrived, Evelyn felt ready. Reed stood beside her on the platform, his presence a solid comfort, and Sarah had insisted on coming along to provide moral support, and also, she admitted cheerfully, to see the woman whose cruelty had inadvertently created the best medical opportunity in the territory. The train disgorged passengers slowly, and for a moment Evelyn thought perhaps they hadn't come after all. Then she saw them. Constance, still elegant but with new lines around her mouth that spoke of sustained anger, and Serena, looking pale and nervous, and considerably less certain of herself than she had in Boston. Constance's gaze found Evelyn immediately, and her expression cycled through surprise, calculation, and poorly concealed dismay. Evelyn understood immediately. Her mother had been expecting to find her daughter diminished by frontier life, worn down and desperate. Instead, she was looking at a confident woman in practical but well-made clothing, standing beside a prosperous rancher and a young assistant who clearly respected her. Evelyn, Constance said, her voice carefully neutral. You look well. Different, but well. I am well, Evelyn replied evenly. Reed, this is my mother, Constance Blackwell, and my sister, Serena. Mother, Serena, this is my husband, Reed Callahan, and my medical assistant, Sarah Mitchell. The introductions were stiff and formal, the tension obvious to anyone watching. Reed helped with the luggage with perfect courtesy that somehow still conveyed that he knew exactly what Constance had done and had judged her accordingly. Sarah made polite conversation with Serena, who seemed desperate for any kindness after months of social isolation. The ride to the ranch was quiet, Constance staring out at the mountains with an expression that suggested she was mentally cataloging everything she found wanting. When the house came into view, however, her composure slipped slightly. Whatever she'd been expecting, it clearly wasn't a three-story structure that would have been impressive even in Boston. "This is your home?" Constance asked, unable to hide her surprise. "This is our home," Evelyn corrected. "Reed built it. The ranch runs 30,000 acres, employs 20 full-time hands, and generates enough profit that we're expanding the medical practice to serve the entire region. Sarah, why don't you show Serena to her room? Mother, you're in the guest room next to the treatment space. Fair warning, we have patients coming and going at all hours, so it's not always quiet." She delivered the information with calm authority, watching her mother's face as the reality of Evelyn's success sank in. This wasn't failure or humiliation or desperate frontier survival. This was thriving on a scale Constance hadn't imagined possible. "I see," Constance said finally. "Well, thank you for your hospitality." The week that followed was a masterclass in controlled confrontation. Evelyn went about her normal routine without modification or apology, treating patients in the clinic while Constance and Serena observed. The first time a rancher appeared with a serious injury, a gash across his forearm that required extensive stitching, Constance turned pale and had to leave the treatment room. Serena stayed, watching with wide eyes as Evelyn worked with calm efficiency. "You're really good at this," Serena said quietly after the patient had left, bandaged and grateful. "I never knew you could do this." "You never asked," Evelyn replied. "None of you ever asked what I could do. You only noticed what I wasn't." Serena flinched but didn't argue. Over the following days, she shadowed Evelyn and Sarah, asking thoughtful questions and genuinely trying to understand the work. Constance, meanwhile, grew increasingly uncomfortable with the reality of ranch life. The early mornings, the physical labor, the direct way people spoke without Boston's elaborate social coding, all of it clearly grated on her nerves. The confrontation Evelyn had been both dreading and anticipating came on the fourth night. After supper, Constance requested a private conversation in the parlor. Reed offered to stay, but Evelyn shook her head. This was something she needed to face alone. "I want to apologize," Constance said once they were seated, and Evelyn nearly laughed at the transparent insincerity. "I may have been harsh in my treatment of you. I was trying to protect Serena's opportunities, and I didn't realize—" "Stop," Evelyn interrupted. "Mother, we both know you're not sorry. You're embarrassed that your cruelty became public and had consequences you didn't anticipate. You're uncomfortable that I succeeded instead of failing. And you're here hoping to salvage something from the wreckage of your social position by associating yourself with my success. But let me be absolutely clear. Nothing you did was protective or necessary or anything other than deliberately cruel." Constance's face hardened. "How dare you speak to me like that? After everything I provided, you provided the bare minimum required by law and social expectation," Evelyn said. "You gave me food, shelter, and education not because you loved me, but because failing to do so would have reflected poorly on you. And the moment you saw an opportunity to be rid of me in a way that could be framed as humorous, you took it without hesitation. You sent me west as a joke, Mother. You weaponized my life to punish a stranger and amuse your friends. And look how it turned out." Constance gestured around the well-appointed parlor. "You have all this. A wealthy husband, a beautiful home, respect in the community. You should be thanking me." "Thanking you?" Evelyn's voice was dangerously quiet. "For years of emotional cruelty? For making me believe I was worthless? For teaching me that my only value was in staying invisible so I wouldn't embarrass you? Mother, I succeeded despite you, not because of you. Everything I've built here came from skills you never valued and strength you spent years trying to break." "I made you strong," Constance insisted. "The difficulty, the hardship, it prepared you for this life." "No. Your cruelty taught me to recognize it when I see it and to refuse to perpetuate it. Your rejection taught me that other people's judgments of my worth are not objective truth. Your joke taught me that sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you is actually the doorway to the best thing possible. But none of that makes you admirable or worth thanking. It makes you the villain in the story of how I learned to value myself." The silence that followed was heavy with decades of unsaid truths finally spoken. Constance looked old suddenly, smaller somehow, faced with the reality that her daughter was neither broken nor grateful. "Then why invite me here?" Constance asked finally. "If you despise me so thoroughly, why let me come at all?" Because I needed you to see it, Evelyn said simply. I needed you to understand exactly what you threw away when you decided I wasn't worth keeping. I needed you to face the reality that your judgment of me was catastrophically wrong. And honestly, I needed to prove to myself that I'm strong enough to face you without crumbling back into the person I was in Boston. She stood, smoothing her skirts. You have 3 more days here, Mother. Use them however you like. Tour the ranch, observe the medical practice, get to know Reed and understand what an actual partnership looks like. But don't expect reconciliation or gratitude or anything other than what you've earned. Polite distance from a daughter who survived your cruelty and built something remarkable from the ruins. She left Constance sitting alone in the parlor and went to find Reed, who was waiting in the kitchen with coffee and the kind of quiet understanding that had become the foundation of their marriage. How'd it go? He asked. I told her the truth, Evelyn said. All of it. She's furious and probably won't speak to me for the rest of the visit, which honestly sounds like a gift. Reed pulled her into an embrace that felt like coming home. I'm proud of you. That took courage. It took 6 months of being valued and respected and loved, Evelyn corrected. You gave me that, Reed. You and this ranch and this life. You made me strong enough to face her. The last 3 days of the visit were quieter. Constance maintained icy courtesy but said little, clearly counting hours until she could leave. Serena, however, became increasingly engaged with the medical work, asking if there might be room for her to stay and learn. I have nothing waiting for me in Boston, she admitted to Evelyn on the final evening. No prospects, no position, no future, except slowly becoming bitter like Mother. But here, I could be useful. I could learn. I could matter. It was an echo of Evelyn's own words from 6 months ago, and she recognized the hunger behind them. You'd have to work harder than you've ever worked in your life, she warned. Medical training is demanding, and frontier conditions make it more so. You'd be dealing with blood and pain and death alongside the successes. I understand, Serena said. And Evelyn, I know I don't deserve your help after my silence in Boston. But if you're willing to give me the same chance Reed gave you, a fresh start based on who I could become rather than who I've been, I promise I won't waste it. Evelyn looked at her half-sister, seeing past the society beauty to the young woman who was finally brave enough to choose something different. Talk to Reed about staying, she said finally. We have room and Sarah could use help now that the practice is expanding. But Serena, understand this. If you stay, you'll be treated exactly like Sarah and Rosa. No special consideration because we're related. No excuses based on your upbringing. You'll work hard or you'll leave. Are we clear? Crystal clear, Serena said with something approaching relief. Thank you, Evelyn, for everything. Constance left on schedule, boarding the eastbound train with rigid dignity and no acknowledgement that the visit had changed anything. But Serena stayed, settling into one of the unused bedrooms and throwing herself into medical training with an intensity that surprised everyone. Within weeks, she proved herself as capable as Sarah, and within months, she was treating routine cases independently. Winter arrived with the brutal force Reed had warned about, bringing temperatures that froze water solid and snow that buried the world in white silence. The ranch slowed but didn't stop, the hands working shorter days but working nonetheless. The medical practice adapted, treating more cold-related injuries and illnesses, stockpiling supplies against the possibility of being snowed in for days at a time. On Christmas Eve, Evelyn stood in the kitchen making proper coffee. Reed had finally learned to brew it correctly after months of patient instruction, and looked around at the life she'd built. Sarah and Rosa were decorating the parlor with pine boughs and ribbons. Serena was in the treatment room organizing supplies with the methodical precision she'd developed over months of training. Miguel and Maria were in the dining room helping Reed set up tables for the Christmas dinner they'd host tomorrow for the entire crew and their families. You look happy, Reed observed, coming to stand beside her at the stove. I am happy, Evelyn said, and felt the truth of it settle in her bones. 6 months ago, I was nobody's first choice. Now you're the most important person on this ranch and possibly in this section of the territory, Reed finished. The person who saves lives, trains healers, builds something that matters. My partner, my wife, my favorite person in the world even when you're covered in blood and yelling at me about sterile procedures. That happened once, Evelyn protested. It happened 3 times and you were magnificent every time, Reed corrected. He pulled her close, and Evelyn leaned into his warmth. "Thank you for taking a chance on this ranch and this life and me. Thank you for asking what I wanted," Evelyn replied, the words becoming their private ritual, "and for actually listening to the answer." Spring came eventually, as it always did, bringing green to the meadows and wildflowers to the hillsides. Evelyn's medical practice continued to grow, and by the time the year anniversary of her arrival approached, she was training 3 assistants and treating patients from a 50-mile radius. Doc Patterson had officially retired, recommending anyone needing medical care to contact Mrs. Callahan at Broken Creek Ranch. The territorial governor had written offering formal recognition of her medical practice and requesting she consider training more assistants to serve other remote areas. On the exact anniversary of her arrival, a warm June afternoon that felt like a different lifetime from the terrified woman who'd stepped off the train, Reed took her riding up into the high country where they could see the entire ranch spread below them like a promise fulfilled.
"I've been thinking," Reed said as they sat on a rocky outcrop watching cattle move like slow rivers through distant pastures. "We should expand the clinic, build something bigger, more permanent. Maybe bring in another physician to work alongside you, create an actual hospital that could serve the whole territory." "That would be expensive," Evelyn pointed out, but she was smiling because she could already see it. A real medical facility with proper equipment and multiple treatment rooms, and the capacity to handle serious cases that currently had to be sent hundreds of miles to Denver. "We can afford it. The ranch continues to prosper, partly because you've kept the hands healthy and working efficiently. But more than that, I want to build it because you deserve the resources to do your work properly. You've proven what's possible with limited tools and improvised equipment. Imagine what you could do with actual facilities."
"We'd need to find a physician willing to work in partnership rather than taking over," Evelyn said, already planning. "Someone who respects what I've built and doesn't expect me to step aside just because I'm a woman without formal credentials." "Then we'll find someone like that," Reed said with the confidence she'd come to trust implicitly.
"We'll build something remarkable together, Evelyn, just like we always do." They rode back to the ranch as the sun set, painting the mountains gold and purple, and Evelyn felt grateful in a way that had nothing to do with luck and everything to do with choice. She'd chosen to take a chance on an honest letter from a lonely rancher. She'd chosen to believe she could be valued for who she was, rather than apologized for. She'd chosen to build a life based on partnership and purpose, instead of waiting for permission to matter. And 6 months later, when Constance Blackwell received a letter announcing that Evelyn was expecting her first child and that the territorial governor had officially licensed her medical practice, making her one of the first women to practice medicine legally in Colorado Territory, the bitter old woman finally understood the magnitude of what she'd thrown away. But by then, Evelyn didn't need her mother's understanding or approval or even acknowledgement. She had Reed's partnership, the community's respect, her patients' trust, and the profound satisfaction of knowing she'd built something real from the ashes of her mother's cruelty. She had purpose, position, and power earned through competence rather than granted through pedigree. She had a life that mattered, and on winter evenings when the snow fell thick and silent outside the windows of the house that was no longer too big because it was filled with purpose and people, and the sound of Sarah and Serena and Rosa discussing medical cases in the treatment room, when Reed read beside the fire and the baby grew strong inside her, and the mountains stood eternal against the darkening sky. On those evenings, Evelyn Blackwell Callahan looked at the life she'd built and knew with absolute certainty that she'd won. Not against her mother, though that was satisfying in its own right, but against the version of herself who'd believed all those years of cruelty and rejection. Against the voice that had insisted she wasn't worth choosing, wasn't worth loving, wasn't worth anything beyond decorative invisibility. She'd won by refusing to be broken, by choosing to be sharpened instead, by taking the worst thing her mother could do to her and transforming it into the doorway to everything she'd ever wanted but been too afraid to name. The cruel joke had failed spectacularly, and Evelyn, the unwanted daughter, the plain sister, the replacement bride who was supposed to be a humiliating surprise, had become exactly what she'd always been meant to be, essential, valued, and finally, home. The mountain stood witness to her triumph, snow-capped and eternal, and the ranch she'd helped build spread around her like proof that sometimes the best revenge is simply living well, living honestly.
living on your own terms in partnership with someone who sees your worth and helps you build a life that proves it. And as spring gave way to summer and summer to fall, and the baby grew and the medical practice expanded and the community continued to flourish around Broken Creek Ranch, Evelyn Blackwell Callahan looked at her life and smiled. Because she mattered. She'd always mattered. It had just taken finding the right place and the right partnership to prove it, not just to the world, but to herself. And that, in the end, was the greatest victory of all.